Many thanks, and that concludes topical questions. And we'll now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6782 in the name of Murdo-Fraser on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee on underemployment in Scotland. I'd invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press their request to speak buttons now, and I would now call on Murdo-Fraser to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Mr Fraser, a generous 14 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Despite what members may think, it is not often that committees break new ground and tackle a topic which has not been considered at some point previously. So I don't think I'm going too far when I say that was the case when the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee embarked on its recent inquiry into the subject of underemployment in Scotland. The committee was also able to demonstrate, contrary to popular belief, that we were able to conduct a short and focused inquiry into a subject matter and not take the required 4 months to agree a report, for which I am very grateful to my fellow committee members. Indeed, I'd also like to put on record at this point my thanks to all those who assisted the committee, our excellent team of clerks, our researchers from SPICE, all those who gave evidence to the committee throughout the process of the inquiry. And can I also take the opportunity to thank the staff at Amazon in Dunfermline for their hospitality during the committee visit there. Those of us who are customers of Amazon or indeed regularly drive past that building were fascinated to see what happens inside. So it was a very successful visit, although sadly we were unable to persuade Amazon that they should pay more of their taxes. But we will leave that for another day. The committee considered 3 main themes in the course of its inquiry, which I will expand upon today. Firstly, what is underemployment and why is it increasing in Scotland? Secondly, who does it affect? And thirdly, what are the costs of underemployment? Now, we're all aware that the Scottish and UK economies recently experienced one of the longest periods of economic downturn since the 1930s. What was unusual about that period in comparison to other periods of negative growth is the behaviour of employment, unemployment and working practices. So at the outset of this inquiry, the committee was faced with the following conundrum. Why has the dramatic reduction in economic output witnessed since 2008 not been matched by a correspondingly dramatic increase in total unemployment? And the answer to that conundrum, in part, is in the increase in levels of hours-constrained underemployment, an increase of almost 80,000 since 2008, according to the Labour Force Survey. So, just how big an issue is underemployment here in Scotland? Well, let's look at a few statistics. There were 264,000 workers in Scotland in hours-constrained underemployment in the period from July to September 2012. That's almost 11% of Scotland's total workforce. Women workers are more likely to be underemployed than men, although there have been significant increases in underemployment amongst both men and women recently. And whilst underemployment is an issue for all age groups, a third of all underemployed men and a quarter of all underemployed women fall into the 16 to 24 age group. And the committee is in no doubt that underemployment is a serious issue, adversely affecting a significant section of Scotland's population. So we set out to try and find the causes of underemployment, its impact on individuals and the economy as a whole, and why the phenomenon has been increasing to such a degree in recent years. Despite underemployment having been an element of the labour market for many years, we found that there is surprisingly little in the way of research and statistical data available on the causes, the effects, and thus the possible solutions. Underemployment in its simplest form is defined as people being unable to work all the hours they want to work and can best be labelled hours-constrained underemployment. However, we also heard evidence of another type of underemployment, probably best described as skills underutilisation, where individuals are overqualified for the job they are in. And that is particularly evident in the case of new graduates leaving university, perhaps not able to get a job at a graduate level and taking lower-level employment, at least on a temporary basis. Yes, of course.
I thank the member very much for giving way. I was reading his report with interest, although I wasn't on the committee. Can you explain why, when we deal with employment and unemployment figures, it's hard facts, but when it's to deal with unemployment, we're talking about people may wish to work and others feel that their skills are not utilised? That seems a little bit subjective.
Murdo-Fraser.
The member raises a very valuable point. The data that is collected in terms of the labour force survey is quite clear in terms of the hours-constrained underemployment. So we have very accurate figures on that, as far as I understand. Skills underutilisation is much harder, because you're absolutely right, Mr Mason, that is to a degree subjective, and it's difficult to be definitive about the figures there. And that leads us on to some of the conclusions the committee came to about the need for better collection of data, which would help better inform this debate. And I want to say a bit more about hours-constrained employment. There is a lot of data around this, and it's easier to quantify. The average hours per worker have been falling more rapidly than employment levels since 2008. The Scottish Government produced figures showing that since the onset of the economic downturn in 2008, the number of workers in Scotland who are in hours-constrained underemployment has risen by 76,000. So, although there is some data on this issue, the committee found it difficult to fully assess the extent of hours-constrained underemployment and therefore its impact on wider society. Now, in relation to the question of underutilisation of skills, the Scottish Government clearly is concerned about this issue, establishing a skills utilisation leadership group in 2008 to champion the skills agenda. What is also clear from the evidence is that businesses are also very concerned, with Scottish Enterprise describing the skills aspect of underemployment as critical, and SCDI describing it as a long-term challenge for the economy of Scotland. Given the distinct lack of research and data on this topic, we found that analysing the reasons for why a high number of people in Scotland are working in a job for which they are overqualified and overskilled is a lot simpler than finding the solutions to this problem. And we therefore asked the Scottish Government to collect data on trend data on skills utilisation in Scotland, and that is something I hope the Cabinet Secretary will be addressing in his remarks. So why is underemployment increasing? Well, there are a number of reasons for this, some more obvious than others. Clearly, the economic downturn has resulted in a reduction in demand for labour, and thus in increased levels of unemployment and underemployment. But that is not the whole story. We heard that during and immediately after the 2008-2009 economic downturn, levels of unemployment were much lower than initially predicted. And it is, in fact, the more flexible nature of the labour market that has allowed firms to retain staff during these challenging economic times, allowing employers to reduce hours rather than headcount, so being better prepared to meet demand once the economy picks up. So we have this flexibility, but it comes at a price, with an increase in insecure, temporary and part-time work, leading to squeezed household incomes and a great deal of anxiety for the many families affected. So rather than hearing that work is a route out of poverty, we heard that due to people working fewer hours, receiving less pay and having a lower level of skills, a key characteristic of the recent economic downturn has been an increase in the number of people experiencing in-work poverty. That's why we feel it is essential that the Scottish Government's labour market targets are adapted to reflect an ambition to grow the number of hours people are in work, to improve the quality of jobs in Scotland, as well as the types of contracts used. Now, we heard about some of the trends that emerged during the recent economic downturn, such as labour hoarding, displacement, increases in part-time self-employment, and the use of zero-hour contracts by both private and public sector employers. Labour hoarding has had a dual impact. On the one hand, it has helped businesses to retain skilled staff during the downturn and therefore restricted the number of redundancies, whilst on the other, it has increased the number of those forced into underemployment through reduced working hours. Underemployment and unemployment have also contributed to the displacement of lower-skilled workers, as graduates and other highly qualified individuals are forced to take jobs far below their skill level. The resulting displacement leads to the lowest skilled, and that often includes the young, being denied access to many labour market opportunities. Whilst on the surface statistics showing an increase in the number of self-employed people are to be welcomed, we heard that in reality many people are in part-time self-employment through necessity, and as a result could be experiencing real hardship. This represents a significant new trend in the Scottish labour market and as such would merit further analysis by the Scottish Government. Another trend highlighted by the committee is the reported increase in the use of zero-hours contracts. Used across various sectors, workers are not contracted to work a fixed number of hours per week, but should still be available to work if required. Indeed, most workers on zero-hours contracts have no guarantee of any work at all in any given week. The Office for National Statistics Labour Force Survey estimated that there were 117,000 people on zero-hours contracts in the UK for the period April to June 2012. Unfortunately, there are no separate figures available for Scotland. We heard that zero-hours contracts provided neither job security nor financial stability and are used by both the public and private sector. Although we do recognise that there are some people who do like the flexibility of zero-hours contracts, they are not always to be seen as a bad thing. We understand that the Scottish Government's forthcoming procurement bill could provide an opportunity to attach conditions to contracts awarded to public bodies to limit the use of zero-hours contracts by public sector contractors, and I'd be grateful if the Scottish Government could address that particular point in their contributions. Let me now turn to those most affected by underemployment. The committee heard that there are two groups in particular have been adversely affected by the rise in underemployment: young people and female workers. Firstly, there is no question that underemployment has had a disproportionate impact on young people. The figures are startling. In percentage terms, young men aged 16 to 24 constitute 32% of the total number of male underemployed workers, and for young women aged between 16 and 24, it is 25.6% of the total number of female underemployed workers. And this includes both graduates and non-graduates, and is much higher than any other group affected. And worryingly, we also heard that the impact on young people can be significant and can have a cumulative effect. So, for example, an inability to gain work experience can mean that a young person is not able to acquire the necessary skills and experience to progress in their chosen career, resulting in them remaining in low-paid work over a longer period of time. This in turn impacts on their ability to be financially independent and prevents them from reaching their full earning and professional potential. We also heard that there is a gender dimension to underemployment, with recent statistics identifying there are over 20,000 more female workers than male workers underemployed in Scotland. Now, this is due to women being employed more predominantly in the service sector and in part-time jobs, often due to childcare and family commitments. The proportion of part-time workers who are underemployed is over 4 times greater than that of those who work full-time, at 22.6% and 5% respectively. The potential long-term impact of underemployment on both of these groups is of particular concern to the committee. Witnesses suggested there were a couple of other groups who might be disproportionately affected by underemployment. Evidence presented to us suggests that disabled people and carers may be experiencing higher levels of constrained underemployment than the workforce as a whole. Older people may also find themselves more likely to be underemployed due to a combination of an increase in the pension age and financial pressures. As there is very little data available on either group, this is another area where the Scottish Government could provide some valuable research and analysis. Finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, the committee considered the costs of underemployment. During my speech, I have touched on a number of ways in which underemployment affects people and its impact on the economy. During this inquiry, we were struck by the human costs of underemployment and its link to health issues and poverty. So we heard about a young person who could not take their first step on the career ladder and develop their skills to further their career. The graduate who is employed in a job in which they cannot use their skills or expertise. An older person suffering financial hardship because they are unable to find work to supplement their income. A woman who would be worse off working more hours due to the high costs of childcare. And there are also the economic costs, such as lower income levels resulting in less spending power, and a workforce with reduced skills and less access to training opportunities impacting on productivity levels. To conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, This has been a thought-provoking and enlightening inquiry in many ways, but has sometimes raised more questions than it has answered. As a committee, we were left in no doubt about the human and economic costs of an underemployed workforce. What we were less clear about is what are the solutions to tackling this issue. We need to look beyond the headline employment and unemployment statistics to find out what is really happening in Scotland's labour market. Given the clear lack of information, the first step needs to be the collection and analysis of data on underemployment, the groups it affects, and the impact of recent labour market trends. I sincerely hope the Scottish Government will lead the way in undertaking this work. While there is an expectation that underemployment will reduce as the Scottish economy returns to growth, the Scottish Government needs to act now to prevent hours-constrained underemployment and skills underutilisation becoming permanent features of the labour market. Working across all levels of government and with private companies, schools, colleges and universities, we should be aiming for the increased labour market participation we want to see in the fullest sense of that word. And with that, Deputy Presiding Officer, I have pleasure in moving the motion in my name.
Many thanks. And then we've quite a bit of time in hand today, so I now call on Cabinet Secretary John Swinney. We have a generous 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, can I begin by recording the Government's thanks to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee for undertaking the inquiry into underemployment, which was a timely inquiry. I have written to the convener this morning with the Government's initial response to the recommendations that are made in the committee's report, and I'll cover some of that ground in the course of my contribution, but will also reflect on the issues that are raised by members in the debate today to determine what further steps the Government can take in this respect. As we emerge from the economic downturn and see positive indicators in both the economy and on the issue of employment, it is important that we consider the cause and effects of underemployment and agree how the Government can work with employers across Scotland to tackle any negative effects arising out of underemployment. The committee has produced a wide-ranging series of recommendations, and I will cover some of the Government's response in my remarks today. At the outset, could I set out the Government's objectives for the labour market? The Government considers worthwhile and fulfilling employment as an essential component in achieving our purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth. We believe that all individuals should be able to fulfil their potential and to utilise the skills that they have acquired through participating in the educational and training infrastructure of Scotland. This approach is central to tackling the issue of underemployment and will run through the response that the Government makes to the committee's report. A key point made throughout the report concerns our level of knowledge about the impact of underemployment on individuals and overall productivity. While recognising that Scotland goes further than other UK countries in regularly publishing data on underemployment, the committee believes that more of the data that we hold should be published. Further, the committee believes more work needs to be done to assess the impact of both time and skills-based underemployment. We do know that underemployment is not in itself a measure of the strength of an economy. Although their rates are slightly lower than the UK, strong economies, such as both the German economy or the Swiss economies, have relatively high levels of underemployment. It is therefore difficult to establish a clear and strong correlation between underemployment and economic performance. One of the other issues that is considered on this issue is the wide acceptance that a flexible labour market is essential to delivering continued economic recovery. But it is important to recognise that some groups, young people, women, older workers and disabled people, may be adversely affected by underemployment, and the Government agrees with the committee that we need to look further at the problems that these groups specifically face. I have asked officials to consider what additional data that we hold could be published to provide some further illumination of the circumstances that arise on these questions. Some data, such as that on carers in the labour market, for example, which will be inextricably linked to the discussion around underemployment, is more challenging to derive from what is collected, and again I have asked officials to consider what more can be done about this. Work will also be undertaken to update the skills utilisation measurement framework in the coming year to help us better understand the impact of the concerns and issues that have been raised. Mr Fraser raised in his contribution some of the comments made in the committee about our labour market performance. In specific, the committee expressed the view that the current labour market participation target, which records employment, does not reflect the health of the current labour market. These questions are considered within the National Performance Framework Scotland Performs, which was established in 2007 as a mechanism to create wide acceptance and understanding of the major contributory factors to achieving our purpose as a government, and to openly assessing our contribution or the contribution of different interventions to achieving increased sustainable economic growth. This framework has attracted international commendation, and the Government is prepared to look at some of the elements within that framework within the context that we do feel we have a pretty comprehensive and robust framework that can judge the performance of the economy and can judge the wider health of the interventions that we take forward in delivering economic recovery. I have already commenced wide-ranging discussions across the political spectrum in Parliament and with stakeholders to consider how the framework might be strengthened, and I will advise Parliament of the outcome of that work, and I will ensure that the issues that have been raised by the Economy Committee are included in that process as part of the exercise. I agree with the Committee's belief that one of the drivers of rising underemployment has been the economic downturn. That must be an inevitable consequence of assessing the data in this respect. The Government will work to reduce levels of underemployment as we focus on delivering economic recovery. Recent economic and employment figures demonstrate that we are making progress on the wider labour market. Over 2012 as a whole, output rose by 0.3% in Scotland, with Q4 showing growth of 0.5%. The Labour Force Survey employment figures published in May for the period January to March this year showed the largest increase in the employment level in Scotland since records began in 1992. And youth unemployment continues to fall, with a rate currently 3.7 percentage points lower than the UK rate of 20.3%. As the Government's efforts bear fruit in delivering recovery, we will continue to focus on creating a fulfilling labour market as part of our wider work in supporting economic growth in Scotland. It is welcome that the report also recognises the Scottish Government's financial commitments to promote economic development. Our capital investment programme is a central element of our approach to supporting recovery, and despite the significant reductions in capital expenditure that we have had to plan for, the Scottish Government investment programme is on course to spend £3.1 billion for 2012-13. Scotland's enterprise agencies have a key role in supporting economic recovery, and I agree fully with the point made by the committee regarding the need to maximise outcomes from investments to sustain and to stimulate growth. The Government and its enterprise agencies work closely together on the delivery of economic objectives, all of which is related to the impact on the labour market. In 2012 to 2013, for example, Scottish Enterprise leveraged £60 million of new investment in growth companies and exporters by investing £30.3 million through the Scottish Investment Bank. And through regional selective assistance, Scottish Enterprise supported projects that will generate £216 million of additional capital investment, all of which will flow through into the health of the Scottish economy. A key part of the work of the enterprise agencies is to work with companies to expand productivity and capability within the labour market. That means working to create an investment climate where quality jobs are created and sustained, and good working practices are developed that are beneficial to the individuals involved. The committee's report highlights an increasing level of interest in zero-hour contracts. The Scottish Government does not employ people on zero-hour contracts and is not aware of any issues regarding the use of zero-hours contracts in the context of contracts awarded by the Scottish Government. We do not, however, hold information on the extent of any such practice across the wider public sector in Scotland. The Government will work to establish more detailed information on this specific issue. I certainly will. Mr. Neil.
Thank you, McNeill.
While you're not aware of zero contracts and public procurement, you are not able to say that in terms of the awarding of grants to companies who use the zero contracts, are you?
There's a slightly, I know the point Mr McNeill's driving at. There's a slightly different relationship there in the sense that companies are able to attract investment from the government if they meet certain conditions of investment. What I can't share with Parliament, because I don't have the information, is any circumstances in which there would be concerns about the way in which investment had been used to support any framework that could be described as zero-hours contracts. But if there is any evidence that zero-hours contracts are being used and used inappropriately in relation to services provided to the Scottish Government, it should be brought to our attention, and we will take all appropriate steps to deal with the matter. The Government is also considering what steps could be taken through the Procurement Reform Bill to ensure that procurement procedures take account of potential contractors' approaches to workforce matters where that would be appropriate. We have to recognise that any action would have to be taken within the context of employment law, which is currently a reserved matter, and would have to be consistent with the constraints applied by European procurement legislation. The committee report sets out a number of recommendations regarding learning and skills. Broadly, these cover the questions of how we support those with the lowest levels of skills, how we engage with employers on workforce development, and how we support those who are skills-based underemployed. The overall aim of our reform of post-compulsory education is to ensure that the current and future needs of employers and the economy are central to the delivery of all education. Through activity agreements and opportunities for all, we are ensuring that every young person has access to training or education to enable them to access the labour market. Through the development of skills investment plans for each of the key sectors and skills action plans for other important sectors, we are articulating clearly the industry skills development needs facing each economic growth sector. And through our skills force, we now offer employers access to the full range of national and local support to help employers recruit, train their workforce and grow their businesses. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Government agrees with the Committee that in difficult economic times, underemployment is more likely to occur. But we also accept that it is crucial to growth that everyone is able to fulfil their potential in the workplace. I have set out a number of actions currently underway to understand this complex matter, to work with employers and industry to drive growth, and to ensure that our post-mandatory learning is better aligned to the needs of the current and future labour market. But we have a duty to address challenges in the labour market which may adversely and disproportionately affect Scotland's workforce. So finally, as the committee requests, I will be happy to raise the matter of underemployment with the Scottish Employability Forum and seek members' views on what more can be done to help us better understand and address any negative impacts of underemployment in Scotland today. Sustained economic recovery and growth is our first priority for Scotland, and we must do whatever we can within the powers that we have to remove barriers to the achievement of that aim.
Many thanks. Now calling Ken McIntosh, a generous 8 minutes. Mr McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And my youngest son asked me yesterday why people in Australia were happier than people in this country. I'm not sure how many members will have heard this piece of news, but at the end of last week, the OECD produced a report which ranks Australia as the happiest country in the industrialised world to live and to work. The UK, despite being the 6th richest, comes in at 10th. Now, as with most lads and dads conversations, I pretended, of course, that I knew the answer and said so with authority. But his question certainly got me thinking. Amongst the range of factors that might be taken into account about what makes for a happy country, I would be astounded if employment, and in particular work satisfaction, was not part of the bigger picture. We know from a range of studies, most recently from Oxfam's Humankind Index, that work is important to everybody, but that even more important to our sense of well-being is the nature and the quality of that work, the satisfaction that goes with that work. And that's why today's report from the EET Committee on Underemployment is a particularly welcome contribution to our current debate. The effects of the current economic difficulties we have faced in this country have been deeply damaging to individuals and to their families, but they have also been quite different from previous recessions. As today's report reveals, although unemployment has perhaps been slightly lower than would be expected and was feared, in fact, back in 2007-2008, the emerging problem of underemployment has been far greater. The Work Foundation and others have estimated that over the course of this recession, across the UK, the number of people affected by underemployment has increased from 2 million to more than 3 million. That helps illuminate the scale of the problem, but as Stephen Boyd from the STUC also highlighted, it also suggests that perhaps we were too complacent about this issue until now. As he observed, the UK has more low-wage and insecure jobs than any other developed country apart from the United States. What also seems to be clear from the committee report and from other surveys into underemployment is that this is a burden that is not evenly distributed across the population. Certain groups are far more vulnerable. For example, as with unemployment generally in this recession, women and young people are particularly badly affected. There are fewer part-time workers generally compared to full-time workers in our economy, but far greater levels of underemployment amongst those working part-time. The committee also heard evidence from disability groups and others that those already facing disadvantage, such as parents of disabled children, were also more likely to suffer from skills underutilisation, in other words, employed at a lower level. All in all, it adds up to a very worrying picture indeed. The economist David Bell has spoken about the dangers of a new lost generation, of the scarring effect of unemployment on young people. The committee rightly highlights the damage inflicted by underemployment on young people, on their capacity to be independent and on their employment prospects in the future, particularly on those with lower skills. We know that average household income in Scotland has declined, that families are feeling the squeeze, often because of the reduction in the availability of overtime or the hours worked. There is a huge increase in in-work poverty in this country, and I think we should be grateful for the spotlight that the EET Committee has shone on this. What I think we should also be grateful for is the practical list of recommendations for action which the committee has agreed on, and I would hope that the government will respond positively to all of those. First, it is clear that the Scottish Government need to start treating underemployment at a strategic level in a similar manner to the way it currently approaches unemployment. The committee highlights the need to identify labour market targets for underemployment, in other words, to try and grow the numbers of hours people are in work and improve the quality of jobs in Scotland, as well as just the number of jobs. I believe the government generally could be more active, more aggressive in its labour market interventions. The new employer recruitment incentive and the wage subsidy that provides us might be a place to start. Labour hoarding has emerged from this report as an issue. It is good that firms have worked to keep their employees on in the face of the downturn, but as the recession continues and demand fails to pick up, this is proving unsustainable. On the continent, in Germany for example, a different approach has been tried. Workers build up reserves of overtime and pay with their employers through good economic times, which are then used to tide them over in downturns. Furthermore, one particular government intervention is directed at saving long-term employment in firms. Rather than picking up the costs of employment benefit, the government has intervened to subsidise jobs for up to 6 months, rather than see that firm go out of business for good. Now, these are policies, I believe, worth further exploration. The whole issue of zero-hours contracts is also receiving a welcome amount of attention and scrutiny. The recession has undoubtedly created what one might term an employer's market, which the less scrupulous are using to their advantage. And I have to say, I would include in that bracket of the unscrupulous the Westminster Government, which is trying to unpick some of the employment rights that have been put in place over the last decade or more. There is clearly no connection whatsoever between employment rights and the economic difficulties we have been faced with over the past 5 years. And it is difficult to conclude, therefore, that any moves against employees is anything other than politically motivated, rather than stemming from evidence that this will somehow benefit our economy. As it is, the number of UK workers on zero-hours contracts has increased by 46% over the last 5 years, an increase especially marked amongst the young. Such contracts are particularly prevalent in retail and finance centres, where they are used by up to a quarter of UK employers, and also in the private care sector, with a recent survey of home care workers reporting that 41% are on zero-hours contracts. I am sure there is not a member here who is not aware of how stressful and disruptive such employment practices can be to family life. Aside from the fact that they do not provide a guaranteed weekly or monthly income, the short notice that people are given in the expectation that they will turn up for work is difficult for anyone to manage and well nigh impossible for those with childcare commitments. They also cause complications for those trying to claim income-related benefits, so the government's own anti-poverty measures are undermined. Now, on the Labour benches, we are certainly looking for a commitment from the government that they will use the forthcoming procurement bill to ensure that the public sector is not just an exemplar employer, but that no companies bidding for public sector work will be allowed to use zero-hours contracts. And a good place to start might be the First Minister's favourite company, Amazon. And I noted the Cabinet Secretary's comments a few minutes ago in answer to Duncan McNeill's questions. And I was slightly disappointed in that I would hope the Minister would be more proactive. If I may draw his attention to an article, this is in the magazine Personnel Today. It's an article, it's a legal Q&A about zero-hours contracts. It talks about the unintended consequences of the new laws on agency workers driving people onto zero-hours contracts and how it's created a perverse incentive. But it concludes in this list of Q&A without any trace of irony whatsoever with the question, what can I do to minimise the risk of zero-hours workers acquiring employment status? In other words, it's advice to companies to make sure that those in zero-hours contracts do not become regarded as employees. I'd be happy to give way to
John Wilson.
Would Mr Macintosh not agree? The sooner that this Parliament has full powers over employment legislation, the better it will be for Scottish workers to protect them from the very issue that he is raising about zero-hour contracts.
Can I say, I'm very disappointed by Mr Wilson's question. I have a huge regard for Mr Wilson. I know how much he cares about this matter, as with many colleagues in the SNP benches. But how many times do we have to hear of the Constitution as a reason for inaction? We have many powers in this Parliament. And we have just, Duncan McNeill and other members, I'm sure, will talk about zero-hours contracts, about the procurement bill. So the procurement bill is something that Mr Wilson has direct influence over his government, and that is something that could be used to enforce our will.
Mr Wilson, if you'd like to rise and take part in the debate, be very welcome.
If you're not. But I recognise Mr Wilson's concern for this matter, but I would ask him to please shake off the constitutional framework for 1 second and think about what we can do now with the powers before us. Because I believe there's a lot the Scottish Government can do in a host of ways. The trend to part-time, for example, part-time and temporary contracts is not one simply for the private sector. The number of teachers who were moved from full-time permanent contracts to part-time temporary contracts was a problem identified throughout the last administration. The public sector generally has a duty to pursue best value, but when best value is so often measured by cheapest price, that stands in direct contradiction to some of the issues that have been addressed in the report before us today. Now, one of the most important conclusions and recommendations in the committee was in its call to Skills Development Scotland and to the Scottish Funding Council to further consider ways to increase access to further education, training and work. The Cabinet Secretary has defended the Government's emphasis on full-time education, but the whole nature of underemployment suggests that part-time further and higher education has a crucial role to play. The very fact that in terms of headcount, tens of thousands of Scots are now being denied access to the skills, the education, the training that may help them, even if simply in terms of their own self-esteem, I have to say, is a lamentable failure of this particular government. Now, I appreciate the Scottish Government may not accept Labour's entire prescription for improving our economy and for attacking underemployment, but if it at least begins by accepting the work done by the Parliament's EET Committee, it will have been a helpful contribution indeed. The First Minister and others are fond of quoting Joseph Stiglitz, as if by associating themselves with this renowned and, I must say, thoroughly admirable economist, that somehow bolsters the argument for independence. But the bulk of Professor Stiglitz's work is about addressing the idea of sustainable economy and a sense of well-being, securing good quality, long-term, sustainable jobs. That's what Joe Stiglitz's vision is for Scotland. It's a vision that we share in the Labour Party. We'd be happy to work with the Government on that in developing manufacturing policy, industrial policy, rethinking our approach to our banks, supporting credit unions, supporting community ownership, in asking firms to pay a fair amount of corporation tax, in asking ourselves who runs our economy and for whose benefit, and that way perhaps we can restore some of the pride, the fulfilment and prosperity that should be secured by employment. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now call on Gavin Brown. A generous 8 minutes. Mr Brown, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by apologising to the Chamber for missing the first minute or so of this debate? We just heard from Ken McIntosh, who decided to kick the United Kingdom Government for all that they are doing. He decided to kick the Scottish Government for all that they are doing. He was kicking big business. He was kicking small business. He was kicking even magazine publishers. I can't help but think that the survey may be very different next year in terms of countries' positions if Mr McIntosh were to spend the next 12 months in Australia. And perhaps Australia wouldn't be the happiest place on earth any longer, and the UK might be that little bit happier going forward. Can I join in all seriousness, congratulate all opening, or join with all opening speakers in congratulating the committee in undertaking this piece of work and in producing which I think is a very thoughtful and interesting report. It is quite clearly a complex topic, and I think, certainly within my time in the Parliament, I think it's the first time that underemployment has really been put under the microscope, and it's the first time, to my knowledge anyway, that it has been debated in the Chamber to the level that it has been so far today. The fact that it's a complex topic was outlined very early in the report when it quite quickly broke down the two general types of underemployment that the committee encountered. Murdo-Fraser, in his opening, referred to them both, but hours-constrained underemployment and skills underutilisation underemployment. And there are huge difficulties with both. In relation to hours constrained, we may have fairly accurate figures, and I acknowledge the additional work the Scottish Government does for the boost in the ONS figures for Scottish results. Finding the figures, I think, is ultimately straightforward, but working out what to do in response to those figures is a far more difficult question. But when it comes to skills underutilisation, even how to measure it correctly and accurately is a difficult problem. How you would then do something about it is even trickier. But I think, as John Mason alluded to in his intervention on Murdo-Fraser, because there is a high degree of subjectivity related to skills underutilisation, simply working out the scale of the issue or the problem is not easy. And we're certainly interested to hear. Sure, happy to give it.
John Mason.
I wonder if part of the answer to this, if the member would agree, is that at school level and quite early on, we need to be aligning up young people with where the jobs actually are in future.
Gavin Brown.
I think I couldn't disagree with that at all. I think definitely yes. Starting at school level, but obviously taking it all the way through. People, of course, accrue different skills. People change their mind as they go through their educational process and journey. But yes, trying to get alignment, or a better alignment, between employment opportunities and the skills that we train people in is a challenge that every government has faced, including the current one, and one that we have to continually improve upon. The committee, I think, concludes that the downturn and decline in output has resulted in a reduction in the demand for labour, and they do conclude, I think, that underemployment is likely to decrease as demand for labour increases, although I have to say it's unclear what that rate of decrease will be, and indeed the timing of the decrease. But looking at the figures themselves, it does appear to me that even once the economy starts motoring again, even after a couple of years into that, we're still likely, I think, to face the challenge of underemployment and have to wrestle with some of the issues that this report quite rightly covers. If we look at two of the charts produced in the report, the average rate of underemployment in the UK between 2005 and 2008, so the years immediately preceding the crisis, the average rate at that point was just over 7% in terms of underemployment. The average rate between 2009 and 2012 is 10.2%. So it is quite likely in the normal course of events that you will see a reduction in underemployment as the economy improves. Whether you see any reduction greater than or lower than 7.1%, which is where we were, is questionable, and we'll still have the best part of two-thirds of the underemployment if those figures turn out to be correct. Murdo-Fraser raised the point, I think, near his conclusion, that ultimately the report raises more questions than answers, and I think that's a fair point. I think it's a true point. And there's a couple of questions I think are worthy of greater work, greater exploration to try and find some of the answers to the problems posed. One of the things that jumped out at me looking at the what are described as the regions across the UK, there does seem to be a fairly similar picture across most parts of the United Kingdom, with one exception, and the exception being Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland currently has an underemployment rate of 6.3%. The next lowest is the east of England at 9.7%, going all the way up to 11.5% for the north east. There's a marked difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of underemployment as it stands today. I wonder what the reasons are for that, and it strikes me as something that might be worthy of looking into to see if there is something that can be learned. Northern Ireland today, 6.1%, is actually lower than any other part of the UK was in the boom years. The lowest in the boom years was 6.5% underemployment in the south east. Northern Ireland today, in the height of an economic downturn, has a lower underemployment rate than any other part of the United Kingdom had, even when the economy was motoring along. Why is that, and is there something that we can learn from that? Secondly, Deputy Presiding Officer, how does the spread of underemployment work across various business sizes? We've had some breakdown around business types, so retail and hospitality, tourism, for example, seem to be particularly high. How are the numbers of those who are underemployed split amongst micro businesses, small businesses, medium-sized businesses and large businesses? Is there any pattern to that at all? Is there any link between the size of an enterprise and the level of underemployment experienced? What are we going to do in relation to the issue raised by Highlands and Islands Enterprise when they gave evidence to the committee? Their view is that the annual population survey underestimates underemployment in the Highlands and Islands area. They think it's probably significantly more prevalent than the national statistics indicate, especially in fragile areas where very much employment is part-time or casual. And indeed also, why are there quite stark differences between full and part-time as between public and private sectors? What I mean by that is this: underemployment for full-time workers is actually higher in the public sector at 5.2% compared to 4.9% for the private sector. A small difference, obviously, but it's still marginally higher in the public sector. But when it comes to part-time workers, the position is flipped. Underemployment for part-time workers in the private sector is 24% compared to 18% for the public sector. So why are there differences between the public and private as opposed to who has higher underemployment depending upon whether it's full or part-time work? Deputy Presiding Officer, I see my time is coming close to an end, but I think I think the committee has produced an excellent and thought-provoking report. I do agree with many of the conclusions, particularly that the Scottish Government should monitor developments closely. I was encouraged by what the Cabinet Secretary said about the Scottish Employability Forum. I agree that it ought to be part of their work programme. And I think we have to look specifically at the impact on the issues on young people, the gender question that was put there, and the protected characteristics question that was put there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of a generous 6 minutes, and there is time in hand at the moment for interventions to be reimbursed. Mike Mackenzie, to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Presiding Officer, I must start by acknowledging the valuable input of colleagues in this inquiry and thanking all who assisted us, especially the committee clerk and their team, and also the witnesses who gave us much valuable information. Underemployment is a phenomenon that has only recently been recognised, and the committee have discovered in the course of our inquiry that it's complex and still not well understood. Nevertheless, it's still possible to make some broad observations. There is no doubt, for example, that a major cause is the Great Recession that Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling led us into. Of course, this recession is also, if you'll let me make a bit of progress on me later, there is no doubt, for example, Of course, this recession has also been experienced by many other countries, but there are reasons why it's been particularly acute across the UK, and these reasons are in turn linked to underemployment. Underemployment statistics reinforce this view, with the UK now experiencing this at a level of around 10% compared to Yes, exactly.
Kezia Dugdale.
I wonder if the member would recognise that his own committee's report recognises there were 2 million people underemployed in 2008 before the recession. So how can he blame Labour for that?
Mike McKenzie.
Yeah, and if you'd listened carefully to what I'd said, I said that a major cause is the Great Recession. I don't think Kezia Dugdale would seriously attempt to argue that the recession is in no way related to underemployment. So, and statistics reinforce this view, with the UK at 10% and the OECD average at 2.9%, and I would urge Kezia Dugdale to reflect on that. And a large part of the reason for this is the deindustrialisation that has occurred to a unique extent across the UK. And I'm sure Kezia Dugdale will agree with this, largely as the result of Thatcherism. While other countries were modernising their industries, we tossed ours onto the scrap heap. And the committee heard evidence from Professor David Bell that the shift of our economy from manufacturing to a service economy has had a profound effect on the labour market, giving rise to so-called labour market flexibility. No, I'm sorry, I've taken an intervention already, and I've got a lot of ground to cover. That labour market flexibility translates in this context to employment uncertainty. And the acolytes of both Thatcher and Blair believe this to be an economic virtue. But this is merely the thinking that underpins the short-termism of the casino economy. When employment is uncertain, people spend less and demand falls. And since a large part of the reason for our current economic underperformance is the lack of demand, then a flexible labour market can only be regarded as another one of the UK government's economic vices. And chief amongst those vices is, of course, the austerity agenda. And recent warnings from the IMF and the OECD, as well as a very, very long list of economists, are seemingly unheeded by the coalition. The effect is, of course, compounded by UK employment law, which underpins this so-called labour market flexibility, giving rise to the zero-hours contracts we've heard about, and to sometimes bogus self-employment for people who in reality ought to be employees. And as if all this wasn't bad enough, the effect is compounded still further by ongoing welfare reform, giving rise to yet more uncertainty and lowering demand still further. You cannot build economic success on the back of the working poor. And against this background, the results achieved by the Scottish Government have been remarkable, with recent figures for growth and employment outperforming the UK. The strategy being pursued of capitalising on our areas of competitive advantage and our natural assets are proving the Scottish Government's economic wisdom. A disaggregation of growth data shows oil and gas, renewable energy, life sciences and food and drink, amongst others, to be the sectors which are driving our economic recovery and forging an economy which is balanced and therefore resilient. Such dynamic and growing sectors offer the opportunity for high-quality employment. Aligning education and skills and training to genuine employment and career opportunities is an important part of the ongoing work to curb both unemployment and underemployment. And that is why initiatives such as the NIG Skills Academy are so important, where government is working directly with industry in a joint approach towards education and training in areas that offer real opportunity. Presiding Officer, in the face of the economic illiteracy of the UK coalition, the Scottish Government can only do so much to combat the twin scourges of unemployment and underemployment, and the committee fairly acknowledges this in its report. What is missing is the third factor in the equation. With tax-raising powers, the enhanced taxation revenue resulting from economic growth would allow the effect of good government and good economics to be reinforced and rewarded, allowing yet more investment in what would become a virtuous circle of success. Presiding Officer, I look forward to this Parliament achieving full powers and to the day when our engine of success will be running on all cylinders.
Order. Thank you. Margaret McDougall to be followed by Marco Biaggi.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I apologise to the Chamber for my late arrival when I missed the part of the opening speech. An inquiry into underemployment in Scotland was urgently needed, and I am pleased the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee undertook this work. There are two issues I would like to focus on: the rise of zero-hour contracts and skills underemployment. I will talk briefly about the effect of both these factors on women in the labour market. The committee heard a lot of evidence from individuals who had been employed on zero-hours contracts, and that these contracts can have a very negative impact on those who are employed under them. It is my view that zero-hours contracts, where employees are not contracted to work for any fixed amount of hours or any at all, are a vehicle by which hard-won labour rights are being revoked for vulnerable groups of workers, particularly women and young people. Those employed on such contracts have no holiday or sick pay, their job is extremely insecure, and for benefit claimants, the way they claim can be negatively affected, often attracting unfair sanctions, as has happened to some of my constituents. This insecurity and unpredictability often means that the individual is underemployed for a significant period of time, as it is difficult to go to job interviews or to attend training courses if you don't know when you'll be called to go to work and you can't afford to turn down that work when it does come. The Cabinet Secretary John Swinney stated that the Scottish Government does not apply zero-hour contracts when taking on employees. However, the committee heard evidence that they are applied for some companies and organisations in receipt of public funding. For example, 27% of staff at Edinburgh University are on zero-hour contracts. In a letter to the committee, John Swinney argued that although the Government does not approve of these contracts, it is the responsibility of companies contracted by the Scottish Government to provide public services to put in place appropriate contractual arrangements with their employees. That is not good enough. I'll take your...
Mike Mackenzie.
Agree with me that the simple answer to that would be for the UK Government to reform employment law.
Margaret McDougall.
I think there are things that we can do within this Parliament to change things. This Government must use its substantial influence to ensure that the incidence of zero-hour contracts are minimised if it is serious about ensuring a fair labour market that protects the rights of the low-paid and vulnerable. Zero-hour contracts not only turn the clock back on rights to sick, holiday and paternal leave, they reinforce gender imbalance in the labour market. Women's Enterprise Scotland gave evidence to the committee that they have identified a gendered dimension to the problem of zero-hour contracts, as this abusive practice disproportionately affects jobs where women are more commonly employed than men. In the private care sector, a reported 41% of the workforce is employed under these contracts. This severely hampers the capacity of women to become financially stable and productive employees, as even something as basic as planning and paying for childcare can become very problematic. Presiding Officer, I call on the Scottish Government to explore how it can act quickly and decisively to help women who are struggling to maintain a place in the labour market due to exploitive zero-hour contracts. I would also urge all Cabinet Ministers to recognise that, while some zero-hour contracts can be appropriate in some cases, The vast majority of the evidence the committee heard over the course of the inquiry made it plain that these contracts unfairly benefit employers. I turn now to skills-based underemployment in Scotland. I believe that where skilled graduates and others feel compelled to take jobs that do not align with the skills they possess does a disservice to the Scottish economy as well as the individuals affected. The Commission for Employment and Skills noted in evidence to the committee a jobs market that is engaging many experienced people to do entry-level jobs is blocking access to jobs for young people. They observed that this led to a range of social problems and a lack of aspiration amongst some young people. Amongst these social problems was an increase in welfare dependency, a greater demand for benefits advice, and a high incidence of mental health and well-being issues. The lack of... I will take an intervention.
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank the member for giving way. Has there been a study found to see whether or not immigrant and temporary immigrants to this country block as much development as do the adults who are overqualified for the work that you want to see young people doing?
Margaret MacDonald.
We didn't look at that information as part of our inquiry, but perhaps the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister could respond to that in their winding up. The lack of opportunity for underemployment people to maintain and develop their skills and jobs which align with their ability has the potential to become disastrous for an entire generation of graduates and apprentices in Scotland. It is important that the Scottish Government recognises the need to better match access to education and skills development to career prospects in order to boost employability, tackling the imbalance in the labour market. To conclude, I am reiterating the Committee's recommendation to the Scottish Government to collect trend data on skills utilisation in Scotland, particularly taking into account the gender split. We need to tackle the rise of zero-hour contracts, perhaps through the procurement bill, has already been mentioned, particularly in the publicly funded contracts. And finally, on skills underutilisation, as John Mason said in his earlier intervention, the Scottish Government should produce meaningful action to align the highly skilled and educated workforce we produce with the employment opportunities in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Marco Biaggi to be followed by Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And very much when the committee began, there was a focus, I thought, on hours underemployment, but the issue that has been addressed of underutilisation of skills really grew in salience as we went on. And as the constituency representative for at least 13,000 people in full-time further or higher education, it is to this issue that I want to turn in depth. The committee heard in private from an underemployed graduate who had journeyed through unpaid work experience and casual labour in a state of limbo for quite some years, unable to get a first step on the ladder. The more time it was taking, the more graduates were emerging from cohorts behind him, further reducing his chances of getting that job that he had trained for and that he longed for. I found that quite a familiar story, as it's one I saw very many times personally in my own social circles back in the classes of 2004-2005. I can only conclude that the labour market changes that were going on there have become embedded now. Now, there are three very important social justice considerations to the issue of graduate underemployment. Firstly, there is that of displacement that has already been alluded to, where those jobs are taken and, as a result, others simply have a knock-on effect and end up being unemployed. There is also, however, the question that while, yes, graduates are more likely to be from affluent backgrounds than the population as a whole, this is an unrepresentativeness that we in this chamber, I think, have all come together wanting to change. If it takes hold, and I think in some quarters it already has, the image of slaving away on a degree and a student loan for 4 years just to emerge into the same job that you would have had if you had gone straight into it will hit those most risk-averse students the most, those potential students that we are trying to encourage to participate in greater numbers, namely those who have little history in their family of participating in higher education and seeing the benefits that it can bring. Thirdly, if there is an ever more cutthroat battle for graduate-level jobs, the odds are clearly in favour of those who have the personal contacts or the family resources to give them an edge. Now, the committee highlighted a lack of data on ongoing skills underutilisation, but there is one good bit of data that focuses on higher education destinations. It only applies to 6 months after someone has left higher education, but it is regular and it is quite comprehensive. That finds that right now 26.2% of graduates in employment are underemployed. That is to satisfy John Mason and Gavin Brown. They are not in the job types classified by Elias and Purcell of the Warwick Institute for Employment Research 2003 as being graduate occupations. So there is a level of independence to this. The proportion of graduates in employment has itself changed over recent years, though, presumably an attempt to further upskill in a more competitive job market. But having done the further reading for the inquiry, which once led Murdo-Fraser in the committee to call me a swot, I've come to some conclusions about what that is showing. In written evidence, NUS put to us, since the onset of the recession, graduates have been less likely to find graduate-level employment, but have remained less likely to be unemployed than those without degree-level qualifications. However, the Higher Education Destination Survey goes back further than the recession, as does the problem. Although there was a relative peak around 2006-07, Scotland's current level of graduate underemployment is now comparable to 2002-03 or 3-4. That leads me to suspect that this is a structural problem rather than a temporary one. International evidence on this is quite scant, in part because of the methodological issues that are included. But we know from surveys within the UK that Scotland has much more of a problem with graduate underemployment straight after courses than the rest of the UK, and has been doing so for as long as the survey has been published, which is well over a decade. I browsed this morning one major graduate recruiter website which compiles adverts from a whole range of graduate recruiters across the whole of the UK. I found 37 adverts applying to Scotland, 7 of which were from one company that had advertised multiply, and over 100 in the London region alone. I would suggest, yes.
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank the member for giving me, and this may be very simplistic, but we now aim to put 50% of people leaving school into universities. So we're perhaps storing up trouble for ourselves unless we have worked out a work plan at the other end.
Michael Biaggi.
I think there is a point there, but there are examples of other countries that have much higher levels of graduate participation in higher education and then, as far as we can tell, don't have as much of a problem afterwards. I would about to suggest a hypothesis that perhaps Margaret MacDonald would agree with, because I think that the structural lack is linked to why we have poor levels of commercial research and development. We have first-class universities that provide first-class teaching as well as research, but in both of these areas, our universities are working in the face of a UK economy that is structurally very unbalanced. As Margaret Cuthbert put it recently on the economic disparities, they are the result of the fast-growing South, particularly London and the City, acting as a magnet for capital and labour from the other parts of the UK and helping to stoke the growth further. At the same time, the peripheral areas, that's Scotland unfortunately, which are losing their labour and capital to the South, are thus held back even more. In the more poetic words of Liz Lochhead, at the mouth of her greatest river, a great port, a glistening city that sucked all wealth to its centre, which was a palace in the court of a queen. If wealth concentrates geographically, so too does opportunity. Yes, that's as valid for Edinburgh as it is for London, and yes, Germany and the USA have managed to create many centres of prosperity within one sovereign union. But even the smallest land or state has a far wider range of economic powers than our country. The underlying economic imbalance of the UK is now in the spotlight. That is good news, because the more it is scrutinised, the more we will uncover the links between that and the long-running chronic problem we have in providing opportunities for our young people appropriate to their qualifications, their hopes and their aspirations.
Thank you. Kezia Dugdale, to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this debate and congratulate all the members and indeed all those involved for its consideration and its production. I'm keen to reflect today on the issues around self-employment and the role in particular that the government plays in creating and sustaining jobs. But before I come on to that, I think it's important to recognise the remarks in the report regarding the startling figures around youth underemployment. And I think Marco Biaggi spoke particularly well on the impact that has, and indeed on the impact it has on women, which my colleague Margaret McDougall has already touched on. I think the key aspect of the report when it comes to women that's important for the government to take on board is in actual fact that the underemployment of women is probably far greater than the statistics tell us because of the issue of childcare and the fact that women would like to work longer hours but can't because they can't access affordable childcare in order to do so. I think there's a lot in that report for the government to go away and think about. On the issue of self-employment, Murdo-Fraser recognised that it merited further analysis, and the STUC noted that the new self-employed are very different from those in the pre-recession period. And in evidence to the committee, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance welcomed the increased trend towards self-employment, and he too acknowledged the need to explore whether all those business ventures provide economic security and sustainability for individuals. So I decided to do a bit of exploring myself, Presiding Officer, and took to the Department of Work and Pensions Job Match website this morning to see what I could find out. If you're looking for a retail job in the Lothian region today, you'll find just 61 jobs advertised on the website within the last 2 weeks. But when you look at the detail of those 61 jobs, you'll soon discover that 50% of those posts are self-employed posts. Jobs like this one, with Vision Focus Group based in Edinburgh, where you are self-employed, delivering and collecting home shopping catalogues. When you look at the terms and conditions of that job, it says the company has given an assurance that this vacancy enables workers to achieve a wage equivalent to the national minimum wage. So you might just have a chance at earning just over £6 an hour. Not great at all. Or another job with Salient, going door-to-door shopping with the Cleaners catalogue, a job which costs you £250 to actually take up. You have to give the company £250 before you can even go door-to-door to sell catalogues. Another example of a very poor quality job. Or indeed this final job with a company called Momentum In-Store Merchandising, that's working in retail units, doing the displays in the windows. And it says here, successful candidates will be issued a temporary terms of engagement contract. If you are successful, and for the avoidance of doubt, these terms of engagement shall not give rise to a contract of employment between the company and the temporary worker, or the client and the temporary worker. It is the intention of the parties that the temporary worker will not be an employee. So that's a job where you're not actually employed. Well, you are employed for the purposes of the job statistics, but you're not employed for the purposes of your employment rights. That means you don't have employment status. I'm sorry, Mr Mackenzie, if you let me get a little bit further along. Sorry, Ms MacDonald. If you don't have employee status, you don't have a number of important legal rights, such as the right to be unfairly dismissed. You don't have maternity rights. You don't have redundancy rights. So this is a far cry from the sort of high-quality, sustainable jobs that I'm sure that the SNP front bench would like to see in our economy. But the question is, what do we do about it? So the Cabinet Secretary for Finance stated in his contribution that he was in the business of building an economy where quality jobs are created and sustained. If that's the case, I think he needs to take a more hands-on approach with regards to regional selective assistance grants and how they're operated. As colleagues have already mentioned, companies like Amazon have received £10.6 million from the Scottish Government. That's £4.3 million supporting expansion in 2011 and £6.3 million for the construction of the Dunfermline building site. Now, we know about Amazon's failure to pay corporation tax, but what about the terms and conditions that Amazon offer their employees in the workplace? I'd encourage members to look at an article called Amazon Unpacked, published in the Financial Times magazine on the 8th of February. It's a lengthy article which details working conditions in Amazon plants across the United Kingdom. You're not allowed to talk to your colleagues. Sorry, Mr Mackenzie, let me make a wee bit more progress. You're not allowed to talk to colleagues. You can walk between 7 and 15 miles a day. You get scanned every time you go for a break to make sure you haven't nicked anything. Hardly the positive working environment that we'd all want to work in. And we know that they rely heavily on agency staff at peak times with even fewer rights and conditions. Now, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance either believes Amazon are a good corporate citizen or he doesn't. I'd love to know which one that it was. Because I'll tell you something, given that his colleague, the Minister for Youth Employment, has substantially greater left-wing credentials than he does, I'd take a pretty good stab at what she thinks about Amazon R as an employee. And I can't believe for a second that she's comfortable giving so much public money to a company that fails to pay its taxes and fails to give its employees decent terms and conditions of employment. If I'm right, what is the government going to do about it? We give them so much public money and ask very little in return. If the government aren't willing to take this issue on just now in terms of the powers they have in this government, let's hear about their vision for the economy in an independent Scotland. Let's find out what you would like it to look like if you were independent. Because I tell you something, I'm not sure you would agree on the front bench, and Tommy Sheridan and Jim McCall, two of your key Yes Scotland supporters, wouldn't agree either. Is that the reason why we're not hearing the answers?
Order. Can we speak through the chair, please?
Sorry, Presiding Officer. Let's hear the answer. Let's hear the vision for the Scottish economy. Let's find out what the government are going to do about companies like Amazon, who don't pay their corporation taxes, who don't give their employees decent terms and conditions, that create the type of environment and economy where underemployment is such a significant problem that it's on the chair of the chamber today.
Can I stop you a moment, Ms Dugdale? There is time for interventions if members wish to take them, but what we really can't have is shouting out from the sidelines. Kezia Dugdale.
I'm happy to.
John Mason.
I wonder if the member could tell us whose fault it is that they're not paying corporation tax.
Kezia Dugdale.
What do you mean in terms of whose fault it is? It's clearly the fault of the systems that you can pay extortionate lawyers to find gaps and loopholes in the system, but you've yet to come forward with whether or not that would improve in an independent Scotland. And, we've got a government committed to cutting corporation tax, yet somehow think that these companies will pay more as a consequence of that. Which one is it going to be? We're all responsible for letting big business away for too long, but let's come together and work out what we're going to do about ensuring big companies pay their taxes, rather than have an SNP government committed to cutting it 3p lower than the Tories ever could hope to have it at.
Thank you. Paul Brodie, to be followed by Duncan McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I say, firstly, how privileged I am to have been a member of the committee which addressed this particular issue, because, in my opinion, no debate, no issue other than perhaps that of unemployment reflects the major challenges facing us today. I pose this on the basis that, despite the best efforts of our committee adviser and government statisticians and others, we cannot be sure of how big or how small this problem is. As the House of Commons, in its discussion paper on zero-hour contracts, said that due to the nature of the labour force survey, the estimates are entirely dependent on the responses provided by individuals taking the survey. It did say it was possible that people are on zero-hour contracts, but are not aware they're on zero-hour contracts, or are not aware they're called zero-hour contracts. And he went on to say that if this is the case, then the numbers are likely to be an underestimate. And indeed, we couldn't properly assimilate the information that we had with the labour force surveys internationally. Now, despite Scotland's relatively better performance in employment, there is no challenging the harsh impact the economic deceleration has led to a decline in the demand for labour and the impact of those that are underemployed and indeed unemployed. Yet there is the statistical dilemma as to why the transposition of anticipated increases in unemployment to higher levels of actual underemployed. What is this dilemma? A large part of it might have been mitigated had there been a meaningful economic strategy and performance of the London Government, and had that been harnessed to a true skills and work programme, as we are trying and as our Government is trying to do now. The IMF, only last week, informed the economic debate that the UK should drop its austerity programme, but that fell on Osborne's deaf ears. Employment level in Scotland is higher, happily, than the rest of the UK at 71.8%, a number which, of course, we wish to see much higher. But what cannot be understood is as to why it has retained a relatively higher level in circumstances where there is a reduction in capacity, in output, in productivity, circumstances that otherwise might have been anticipated in the severe economic downturn that we have experienced. In such normal circumstances, where real productivity has fallen, and it has fallen 3% below its 2008 peak, then a realistic and regular reduction in employment might have been expected, particularly that there was also a growth in the labour force over that period of time. But it hasn't. Why? One single unblemished achievement of the London government, is that there's a National Institute Economic Review who said there is spare capacity in the economy. Of course there is, because of the economics that we've been following. And I say this to you, when will the slavish Scottish Tories realise that the London government is not working, even today, on the Finance for Lending programme, which was destined to offer cheap money to businesses through the banks? It is a programme which has actually seen, let me finish this point, Mr Brown, it has actually seen a £300 million reduction in business loans quarter on quarter for the first quarter of the year.
Gavin Brown.
Given that he was on the committee that wrote this report and he's more than halfway through his speech, I wonder if he wants to address underemployment at some point this afternoon.
Mr Brown should know I always say the last for best. The majority of the money, of course, has been diverted by the banks, either to shore up their balance sheets or of creating a new bubble in the housing market through increased mortgages. Much easier to get big bonuses that way. Unemployment. I could feel your anticipation, Mr Brown. Underemployment will only be reduced to a reversal in the austerity programme to one of capital investment, where demand would be greater, supply would be higher, and where there would be less pressure on inflation. Frankly, it's the economics of the madhouse. The UK's programme is a dead end, a one-way street to nowhere. That's why we should acknowledge, all of us, without tribalism, and I do think we were constructive in the committee, that our government's commitment on capital spend, on modern apprenticeships, further education, opportunities for all, are the right policies to promote economic stimulus and create a labour demand, and so confront the underemployment chaos. And so it would remove the frustration of the underemployed and what, in some cases, regrettably, is a misplaced stigma of laziness and lack of ambition. Of course, a dynamic economy requires a flexible labour market. But, as was contributed to the committee, the role of temporary recruitment agencies needs to be reviewed in their contribution, and so indeed their effect on the employment marketplace. Just as we have to accept, in my opinion, that notwithstanding the independence debate, and this was also discussed in the committee, one wonders whether or not Job Centre Plus and the work programme would be much better and much more effective if they were a much more integral part of the Scottish employment jigsaw. That's shorthand for saying, in fact, they should be governed by the policies and the processes of the Scottish Government. So, Presiding Officer, underemployment levels are not accurately defined and are exacerbated by an as yet overarching UK economic dominance. There is, however, one conundrum of the evidence the committee took, and it is a bright spot, if that's what it can be called. It's the growth in the number of self-employed levels in Scotland. The increase of 23,000 in the number of self-employed is not, I believe, a fig leaf. The growth in self-employment in the third sector, in social enterprises, underpins the character of Scots to dispose their positive, I believe, their positive work ethic. The rise of these sectors marry that work ethic to innovation and to enterprise. That may be the reason why the statistics are indefinable and even, indeed, unreliable. An unintended revolution. Presiding Officer, underemployment, like unemployment, is a scar upon our society. We can heal them, but not in the present theatre of economics.
Thank you. Duncan McNeill, to be followed by David Torrance.
Officer, I think the committee has produced a very interesting report and should be commended for it. I think they challenge the Parliament to come together and look at the changing nature of employment and work, and how people can be gainfully employed and how they can derive not just economic benefit from that, but that social interaction that we all, certainly if someone of my age grew up with, that it was good to have an apprenticeship, it was good to have a job, it was good to be the charge hand, the yard manager, all of that held our society together. And I think this report is a start, hopefully, to get ourselves as politicians focusing on some of the issues that challenge the people that we purport to represent, because that cosy view of the workplace where people had some power, whether it be in the status of the job that they held, or that they were in a trade union, or the confidence in their skills it gave them, that workplace has changed dramatically. And I would suspect that not many of us actually know the powerlessness that exists in our workforces, because many years ago, some of us were part of that industrial workforce, and it's hard to appreciate the change that has taken place over that time, and quite rightly mentioned by the deindustrialisation that took place. Unemployment in itself is all recognised as a bad thing. Underemployment is equally as bad. Taking a job you don't really want, low pay, subcontract, shift workers, zero-hour contracts. When you are laid off, when the line stops at 6 o'clock in the morning, with no means of getting home. So you sit unpaid in the canteen for 2 or 3 hours while the transport arrives. That's the reality of what's right under our nose, irrespective of our different views about how it's brought about, and probably not as different as we would expect them to be. Yes?
Margaret MacDonald.
Officer, I'm interested to hear the answer from the member's perspective, because he was an active trade unionist. How much, I wonder, does the member think that the trade union movement itself has been acquiescent in the growth of underemployment and part-time employment to cover the fact that we had lost so much real employment?
Duncan McNeill.
Well, there was massive shifts in that deindustrialisation over the piece supported by government, but I would never, ever be in a position that I would sneer or criticise somebody who goes out and works for a minimum wage, because that's not my choice to make. Those people go out there and accept these situations and conditions despite having a trade union or anybody to represent them, because they need to support their family. They're not doing it through choice, but that's the reality. But it's got, I think, one of the points that I want to make, because I think, looking to my colleagues in the Health Committee, as we struggle with this idea about health inequalities, and the World Health Organisation clearly states, and other states, that unless we shift that power and wealth, then we're not going to deal with those health inequalities. As well as putting up with all of those conditions, they have obviously got an impact on that person's well-being. Heart disease is 50% higher in lower-grade employees. There are higher mortality rates, 20% higher, between temporary workers and permanent workers. So these are the hard realities of what people face. Now, some people would say, well, it's okay. Some people would say, as Professor Claire Bamber used a slide in her presentation to the Health Committee, that it's never been any different. Employers are there, and if they get a free hand, they're going to exploit those workers. And William Morris says, at least I know this, that if a man is overworked in any degree, it was 1884, so that's how he's using the man, in case my sisters get that. They're a dangerous bunch. At least I know this, that if a man is overworked in any degree, he cannot enjoy the sort of health I am speaking of, nor can he if he is continually changed to one dull round of mechanical work with no hope at the other end of it. nor if he lives in continual sordid anxiety for his livelihood. That is an apt description of the working poor in our country today. They worry about getting a job, and they worry about holding on to the job. And the job that they take does not satisfy them or fulfil them, either economically or indeed in terms of their well-being. So I'm hopeful that we can use this report to actually deal with some of these issues. And I know that people will have, and it's been said here today that the constitutional perspective will have but solve this. But this is not easily solved. We will need to still attack those employers. We will need to try hard to get, to get employers. And yes, certainly.
Mike Mackenzie.
It's a question of the UK government almost willfully letting all these horses out of the stable, and without even a rope at its disposal, it will be difficult for the Scottish Government to recapture them.
Thank you, Mike
Mackenzie. I say to Mike Mackenzie, we can't absolve ourselves. This is happening right under our nose. People, it's not just in the private sector that these people are being exploited. We are creating conditions in this Parliament that subcontract out caring responsibilities in our local authorities for a cheaper rate of pay. We have people cleaning ministerial offices, not getting a living wage. It's happening right under our nose. We have a responsibility. Of course, in terms of employment rights and other things, there are other governments that should take the responsibility as well. Yes,
Bob Doris.
My Health Committee convener was because you said something a bit more nuanced in relation to companies fulfilling their contractual obligations and proper employment law. You said we still want to attract these employers, and I would agree with you, Mr McNeill. There are clearly two options on the paper, on the table. One would be improving employment law at a UK level, and that may be the members' solution to that. But you also accept employment law sitting in this chamber would also be an opportunity to provide protection for workers. I'm merely asking the member to say there's a balanced view there, and bringing employment legislation to this chamber would also be an opportunity.
Duncan McNeill.
We need to be convinced that under this government or any future government, those powers would be used on behalf of the workers. Now, I don't know, and I've not seen any evidence that that would be the case, because right under our nose we see women workers being contracted out of local authorities, being asked to work for cheaper conditions, fewer holidays. That's happening now. So unless we get our act together and deal with some of those issues, then maybe we could argue about the nuances about where the power lies. Is the will in this place to put some of these things right? Now, we had a very good cross-party recommendations in terms of older care, where we asked for a review of the competitive nature of local authorities. We asked for the Commission to be looked at, and we asked for the living wage to be applied for those who look after our elderly. That's the test for this Parliament. Are we prepared to make that happen? I'll leave it to you.
I now call David Torrance to be followed by Alison Johnston.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to apologise for being late for the opening debate. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the issue of underemployment, which has become a prominent feature of Scotland's labour market today. Since the beginning of the economic downturn, much attention has been paid to rates of employment and unemployment. Despite the overall rise in the number of people out of work, it is reassuring to know that Scotland appears to have fared better than the UK as a whole. Recent figures show an increase in the headline employment rates of Scotland of 1.1% to 71.8% for the period of January to March this year, while the UK has seen a drop of 0.2% down to 71.4%. Youth employment has seen a particular improvement in Scotland, rising by 4.3% over a year, compared to a mere 0.6% increase for the UK. Furthermore, there has been a significant decrease in the number of young Scots aged between 18 and 24 claiming unemployment benefit, a drop of 4,900. Although unemployment figures are important indicators of economic activity, the growing problems of underemployment in Scotland is also a critical concern. At present, 22.6% of part-time workers are underemployed. Women are affected proportionately more than men, with the overall underemployment rate at 11.3% and 8.7% for women and men respectively, as acknowledged by the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee in its report. Unemployment and underemployment should be regarded in similar terms with respect to their importance, as both involve the lack of hours spent in work. Research also found that impact on the well-being of those who are underemployed is comparable in terms to the psychological effects with those who are unemployed, and there is evidence in both groups of a strong link with poverty. Amongst those who are classed as underemployed are those whose skills are seen as being underutilised. Young graduates are one of the groups most affected within this category. In order to tackle the issue, we must examine ways of encouraging and supporting those currently within higher education to focus their learning skills, which will equip them for the labour market upon completion of their course. This can be done, for example, by encompassing work experience programmes in higher education curricula and offering short courses on adapting skills learned through education in the workplace. It is becoming essential for those entering the higher education system to ensure that embarking upon a qualification which will provide them with sufficient employment opportunities in the future. Choosing to train in a field of work with little probability of gaining eventual employment may sadly be a luxury our young people can no longer afford. This means we need to provide support to guide people with their choices they make now, making them fully aware how these choices will impact upon their future career. For those with skills and experience already under their belts, it is important that support is made available to facilitate and align their attributes to suit the contemporary labour market. This may involve the extension of training programmes to help adapt their skill sets from one job role to another, thereby enabling more suitable employment, or an increase in the number of working hours made available due to a consequential increase in the value of that employee. Analysing underemployment from the point of view of the employer, I would like to focus on the use of zero-hour contracts. Under such contracts, workers are officially employed by an organisation, but there is no obligation for that organisation to provide a guaranteed number of hours of work per week. Rather, work is only offered as and when it becomes available. The prospect of such a highly flexible workforce can understandably be extremely attractive to employers. However, the consequences for the workers themselves can be severe insecurity and financial instability. There is also the added difficulty faced by those employed under zero-hour contracts in making themselves available for additional employment due to the potential for irregular hours such contracts may entail. This is clearly undesirable and unsustainable in terms of lifestyle for any prolonged period of time. In order to safeguard members of the working public from the effects of zero-hour contracts, it is critical that we assess their use within the public sector, particularly amongst public sector contractors. We must ensure that conditions are attached to such contracts in order to prevent their misuse, and that provisions are put in place to monitor this. In Scotland, we understand the value of work and of maximising the potential of our country's greatest assets, its people. Not only are these values important to the self-worth and financial security of Scots as individuals, they also play an essential part in rebuilding our economy. Although many of the main tools required to achieve full economic recovery remain under Westminster's jurisdiction, the Scottish Government has embraced the powers it does have to boost jobs and growth to the best of its ability. The Scottish Government has so far employed its limited capabilities in tackling the growing problems of underemployment. However, our ability to determine the direction of the future of our economy is hampered by the powers reserved by Westminster and the damaging effects of a restrictive austerity package which we continue to be subjected to. We must continue to work as best as we can within our means to ensure that we are able to provide Scots with a variety of employment opportunities and to support our workers to fulfil these roles as effectively as possible. Should the Scottish Government continue to demonstrate its necessary commitment and enthusiasm for these goals, given the time, we can get our country back to full working capacity and minimise underemployment for good.
Thank you. I now call Alison Johnston to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I apologise for missing the opening words of the debate. A new United Nations report entitled Global Employment Trends for Youth 2013 tells us that there will be 73 million young people out of work this year. Here in Scotland, unemployment among 16 to 25-year-olds is twice as high as among other adults. Women, too, are hit particularly hard, and those with disabilities. Some commentators have expressed surprise that UK unemployment numbers aren't even higher. But what has become apparent, as the STUC and others highlighted in evidence to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee inquiry, is that a narrow focus on headline employment and unemployment levels doesn't tell the whole story. Unemployment figures hide the fact that many people across the country are struggling to make ends meet on a low income, as opposed to having no income altogether. Underemployment isn't only about a shortage of hours, but can, as we've heard, also mean that many skilled and well-qualified people aren't able to fully utilise their knowledge and abilities. And this is a colossal waste of investment at a personal and national level. Underemployment is not a new phenomenon, but it is increasing, and it affects young people and women particularly badly, and especially those working in the social care, retail and tourism sectors. Many people who previously held full-time posts have accepted reduced hours rather than lose their jobs entirely, and the need to supplement earnings with working tax credits is increasingly common. Evidence from Citizens Advice Scotland reported increased demands for their expertise for a growing number of individuals and families in crisis, as welfare reforms mean eligibility criteria are harder to meet. And where jobs are available, too often these are low-skilled, low-waged and with limited job security. There is a worrying increase in zero-hour contracts, where employees don't have traditional rights and may have no idea how many, if any, hours an employer will be able to offer on a week-to-week basis. Scotland must strive to deliver high-quality, high-value jobs for its workforce, with the best of training and prospects for all. During the inquiry, I questioned the Cabinet Secretary for Finance on the use of zero-hour contracts. I welcomed his assurance that the Scottish Government does not use such contracts and hope that the Public Procurement Reform Bill will ensure that companies receiving public money don't improperly use zero-hour contracts. Margaret McDougall touched on the use of these contracts in Edinburgh University. Indeed, the figure rises to 47% zero-hour contracts for those in the College of Humanities and Social Science. And Mark Porter, the chairman of the BMA Council, has recently said that an expansion of zero-hour contracts in the NHS is of great concern. While they might have a role to play in allowing recently retired doctors to continue to work, they are not conducive to planning coherent, cohesive services which focus on the care of patients. I asked too, during the committee inquiry, about publicly subsidising companies who don't pay an appropriate share of tax, and the response that I received to that question is on the official report. I've heard debate amongst colleagues today. It's my view that the UK Government needs to sort out the loophole-ridden tax system, but in the meantime the Scottish Government needs to work with Scottish Enterprise to tighten up the criteria around those who receive regional support assistance and such funding. We must use the business support we have available to grow Scottish small and micro businesses. It's they who provide sustainable employment to many Scots, and they are more likely to add value to the economy, the local economy. Micro businesses, those with fewer than 10 employees, make up nearly 94% of Scottish business. We should be supporting these as a priority. They provide 27% of the private sector jobs, and over 40% of unemployed people who find work in the private sector go to work in a micro-business or become self-employed. In my remaining time, I am going to focus on the impact of underemployment on women and on young people. The STUC, in their evidence, suggested that due to the many obstacles women face, including caring and childcare duties, they may simply have no choice but to become economically inactive. Kezia Dugdale noted that these women may not even be recorded statistically. The Government's commitment to increase the legislative provision of childcare will help women into and back to work, but it's really important that we understand just why Scotland has the second most expensive childcare in Europe, with 25 hours of nursery care costing more than half the average part-time wage, as highlighted by the Women in Scotland's Economy Research Centre and Children in Scotland. Why are costs so high when those working in childcare, predominantly women, are certainly not amongst the most highly salaried? The TUC noted last year that policies to address the underemployment crisis must recognise that patterns of participation in the labour market are different for men and women, and that women's choices are often conditional on other factors with respect to their household roles and responsibility. The committee is very concerned by the higher levels of underemployment being experienced by young people. Lack of hours, lack of finance inhibits young people's capacity to become truly independent and has an impact on their long-term prospects. We heard from a young underemployed graduate who held 2 casual jobs as he tried to find work in his field of study. He was underemployed in terms of hours and in not utilising his skills and expertise. And he was unable to secure an internship in his subject as graduates of previous years were still in unpaid internships, blocking his pathway. Research into the incidence of unpaid internships and their impact on opportunities to secure employment at entry level are urgently required. But ultimately, it is the least skilled and the young who are most likely to experience barriers in gaining access to the labour market. Underemployment, like unemployment, drives down income, wages and demand. But there is cross-party support for job creation programmes, education and training, and increased awareness of the opportunities of properly supported entrepreneurship and the importance of labour rights in such a tight market. We should continue to focus on opportunities like the Third Sector Internship Scheme and the Community Jobs Scotland Scheme. These are well regarded and provide high-quality work-based training. We must make sure that incentives are available for employers to hire disadvantaged young people. There are some good examples of progress, with Edinburgh Council offering apprenticeships to the looked-after young people in its care, a practice that should be adopted nationally. People who can't find a decent job become demoralised, and denied of opportunity can become alienated. Joseph Stiglitz urges that we cannot waste human capital, our most valuable asset. Unemployment blights the lives of women and men of all ages. Underemployment blights the lives of women and men of all ages. Let's keep this in mind in all that we do. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on John Mason to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it is very good that we are having this report, that it's been carried out, the study behind it, and that we are able to debate it today, and I do congratulate the committee for doing that. I think there is always a danger, as I think has been mentioned before, that we get fixated with 1 or 2 key statistics, for example, employment or unemployment figures, and these are obviously very important. But we can forget to look at the detail behind the figures, which here means not just the employment numbers, but the quality and type of employment that is actually available. The fact that I have been in 1 or 2 other committees, not this one, over the last year or so, gives an added relevance, I feel, to looking at this report. For one, I am on the Equal Opportunities Committee, and we are in the process of preparing a report on women and work. So I feel I should just make a few comments on the issue of the gender dimension of underemployment, although others, including Alison Johnson, have mentioned that already. The figures of 8.7% for male underemployment and 11.3% for female underemployment have to be concerning to us. And on one example that has been coming up a lot at the different committees and in the different reports is the whole area of women returning to work after having had children. They are often forced to downgrade their aspirations in order to get either part-time or flexible employment, and I think we will have more on this when we come to the Equal Opportunities report in due course. Also, during the Finance Committee's study on employability, and now, as I said, the Equal Opportunities study on women at work, the issue of skills alignment has come up, and I am glad to see that has been touched on this afternoon, and certainly in the committee report. On both committees, we have heard reports of good work being done to encourage young people, and especially, it has to be said, young women, to think a bit out of the box and not just drift into the kind of job or training which perhaps their families traditionally did. And while higher further education establishments are important here, I reckon that we do need to start earlier on. It seems to me that the schools definitely have a role to play, and that can include bringing people from different sectors into the schools to broaden young people's thinking, because often we have to accept that the teachers themselves will have had perhaps not a very broad experience of the outside workplace. Because we are still in the situation where students with excellent qualifications, for example in politics or history, are queuing up at our doors looking for work experience, while at the same time it seems that companies like Scottish Power, SSE and the North Sea sector in general are crying out for engineers and similar skills. So I was particularly glad to see paragraph 74 on page 26 of the report, which I would like to quote from. In evidence to the committee, the Cabinet Secretary confirmed the importance of the higher and further education sectors being aligned with the Scottish Government's economic strategy. He acknowledged that, quote, for far too long there has been a disconnect between the aspirations of the business community with regard to where growth will come in the economy and our education community's planning assumptions about where the emphasis should lie, unquote. In particular, he highlighted the growth in the oil and gas renewables sector and the significant skills shortages in engineering. And I see too that that is included as one of the conclusions at paragraph 82. I think we should also accept that in some cases underemployment or even skills underutilisation are not always a bad thing. For example, some of my fellow accountants might feel I was currently not using all of my accounting training in the job I am presently doing. Now, that may be true to some extent, but of course it is out of choice, and I do consider what I am doing to be a high-quality job. I do think, however, that accountancy is a great background for a range of possible career options. But similarly, too, we must not undervalue the graduate mother or father who deliberately stays at home with their young children in order to give them what they feel is the best start of life. And I do note the committee's definition, as I have already mentioned in the intervention, of skills underutilisation, for example, on page 7, paragraph 3, where it says the term skills underutilisation is used to describe those people who would welcome the opportunity to work at a skills level which better match their training, qualifications or experience. I mean, I'm grateful to Marco Biagi for expanding on that a little bit more, that perhaps some of the research is more objective than I had picked up in the report itself. But it does still seem to me strange that we measure employment and unemployment in very definite terms, and it seems to be a little bit more vague and a little bit more subjective when we're talking about underemployment. There is a cost too to the individual and the household, but I think we mustn't forget too the cost to the wider economy, and Margaret McDougall mentioned that in her speech. If we're not using our national resources to best effect, so underemployment is not just some kind of extra that we would like to deal with, but it is absolutely a key economic challenge for the whole country. But having mentioned voluntary underemployment, for most people, underemployment is not desirable and it is not voluntary, and I thought Duncan McNeill put that extremely well in his speech as he described the effect of some people of being in no-hope kind of jobs. One aspect of this, as has been mentioned by several speakers, is zero-hour contracts, and I think that does highlight the need to control employment law. Very often we have seen the European Union trying to improve employees' rights, while reluctant Westminster governments have been dragged along kicking and screaming. And I do think, as part of that, the minimum wage legislation needs to be very strictly enforced, because we do hear stories of people who are paid for 1 hour, paid for another hour, but their travelling time in between is not paid. In conclusion, I was intrigued by Ken Mackintosh's comment that Australians are happier than here, and I think there is a serious point to that. I lived in Nepal for 3 years, and I would say that people there were happier than here as well, and yet that was a very, very poor country. So, going back to Duncan McNeill's point, it is not just about money, although money is very, very key, but it's also things like job satisfaction and hope in the future and where people are going. But finally, the other thought that strikes me about Australia is that they did leave the British Empire and they have never asked to come back.
Thank you very much for that. I now call on Mr Mason to be followed by Anne McTaggart. Anne McTaggart to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Is it me? Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I would like to congratulate the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee on their comprehensive report into the scale and the effects of underemployment in Scotland. I am keen to contribute to discussions on this growing economic problem and to highlight the effects of underemployment on women and young people in particular. Underemployment is a deeply concerning social problem that has the ability to mask the poverty faced by families across Scotland. It lurks behind unemployment figures that fails to reflect the reality of individuals facing financial hardship. I was grateful to read the submission made to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee by Professor David Bell of the University of Stirling. I would like to thank him and his colleagues for their continued research into the social and economic consequence of chronic underemployment in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I accept that for most people part-time work is better than no work whatsoever. However, in Scotland, there are now thousands of people who are looking for no more than a full-time position within the company that they currently work for, or simply for a job that adequately reflects their training, experience and ability. It has been suggested that the answer to the problem of underemployment is more training. Training may indeed be the answer for some young people who aspire to work in specific professions and sectors. It is often a natural solution to a problem that seems to disproportionately impact upon those who have recently completed a course of full-time education. However, I do not believe that the negative effects of underemployment can be dealt with simply by upskilling workers to enable them to compete for higher level positions. And we have heard underemployment is not only about seeking more hours, it is also about working in a role for which you are overqualified. It's the graduate returning to the job that they did before attending university, just to make ends meet. It's the college leaver doing 3 part-time jobs while they look for a 4th. It's about accepting a 0-hour contract despite the fact it offers you no security, guaranteed income or longer-term benefits. This is not to say, however, that greater flexibility in working is not welcome. Part-time contracts can, and in particular circumstances, offer some individuals a way of accommodating family and other commitments alongside their working life. However, choosing to seek a part-time job is not the same as being compelled to take one in order to secure some work, however infrequent that is. That is why I am joining my Scottish Labour colleagues in calling on the Scottish Government to ensure that the upcoming procurement reform bill guards against the damaging use of 0-hour contracts by companies bidding for public sector contracts. I am also concerned by recent statistics regarding the profile of those experiencing underemployment. Alongside young people, women are disproportionately affected. If we are to continue to break the barriers of gender inequality that we face across the country, then underemployment must be addressed. I am pleased that the committee believes that improved childcare provision is important in tackling this, and would also urge them to consider deeper analysis of the causes of gender imbalance in those suffering from underemployment. The ongoing economic challenges we face in Scotland has had deep and damaging consequences for families across the country. We must work to ensure that surface improvements do not mask those who are struggling to make ends meet. Underemployment is a symptom of an economy that is failing to meet the needs of ordinary people. I urge the Scottish Government to do all it can to address the damaging effects of these employment practices and to end the exploitation of workers on low incomes by large corporations for financial gain.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Margaret MacDonald. Mr Stevenson, a very generous 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm not a member of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, and so it's my delight to say words that are so seldom heard in this Parliament. Congratulations to Murdo-Fraser and, of course, the other members of his committee for what is a very interesting and engaging report. It's a report that's going to give us more questions than answers, and I think at this stage of looking at this subject that's not too surprising. Today, I'm in my last day as the Deputy Convener of the Subordinate Legislation Committee. Indeed, it's the last day of the Subordinate Legislation Committee. But we rise phoenix-like tomorrow as the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, and I am suitably translated into my new position as the Deputy Convener of that. So now John Mason knows at least what ex-ministers are equipped to do, since I make no claim to be underemployed or underskilled for the job that I have. I think the committee sort of gives the game away of the complexity of the subject that's before us in Parliament today, in that it spends an entire A4 page discussing what is underemployment. And I think, in honesty, a good shot, but probably the committee would agree that we probably haven't nailed it down absolutely firmly, because it isn't absolutely clear what underemployment would be. We basically rely on statistics where we ask individuals their view of their own situation, and different people will view it in different ways. First job I had when I left school before I went to university as a nurse in 1964, I worked a 108-hour fortnight, so almost anything after that is going to look like underemployment if I applied the test of my 108-hour fortnight, 12 days on, 2 days off, in 1964. So I think there are imprecisions likely to be in the statistics. Now, having said that, I think it's probably relatively clear that there is significant underemployment. Kezia Dugdale sort of gave the game away by suggesting that it was significant in 2008. Yes, in the UK, probably 2 million people were underemployed, but of course that was nothing to do with the fact that Labour had been in power for 11 years. Well, she might actually be right, because, of course, the stats don't go far enough back to justify a robust conclusion. But the numbers are going up, and therefore it's correct that we should be looking at what that is. Now, the committee has asked the Scottish Government to improve the quality of statistics, to look at how labour market stats could be adapted to take account of developing trends, and in particular, perhaps, underemployment. And I think that's equally applicable to the UK Government. The Office of National Statistics serves both governments, and therefore perhaps they should be asked to do some work to think about how better we can understand what is the nature of and the quantum of underemployment. We do know that employment is rising. We are now up to, for 16 to 64-year-olds, that excludes therefore me, up to 71.8%, and indeed Mr Brodie, who's chuckling in the margins as well. But nonetheless, whenever people want to work and cannot work, that is an issue we properly engage with. And I think many have referred to the fact that females are disproportionately affected. And I think that, too, is important for us to consider. The trends are probably reasonably informative, but even they are not robust. Lawrence Pomeroy, who was the chief engineer of Vauxhall Motors in the 1930s, said, if you have to measure an improvement, you probably haven't made one. Well, I don't think we should get too fixated about our inability to measure underemployment, because it's probably sufficiently significant we can see it without having the confidence to say it's this number rather than that number. So I think that it's big enough, although I think it was Deming who said if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So certainly as we respond to the challenge of this, we've got to have better numbers in front of us. Professor Fred P. Brooks, who wrote a book called The Mythical Man Month, posed the question, how does a project get late? And the answer is one day at a time. Well, unemployment and underemployment is very similar. It happens in little slices, and eventually you realise the whole sausage has disappeared. So therefore, the difficulties of measurement should not prevent us from considering this to be a real problem. Now, skills use. Now, that's a real corker of a question. because, of course, I don't necessarily want to use all of the manifest skills that I've built up over my long life, and indeed anyone of my age may have done. I make no exclusive claims in that regard, although I do acknowledge the plaudits from others in the chamber. But the bottom line is we all gain huge amounts of experience as we go through life, and we're very unlikely ever to have a job that can use every skill that we may have. But on the other hand, if there are skills that are of economic value that we ought to be able to deploy in the workplace, and we're unable to find employment that helps us do that, then certainly that is an issue which public policy should respond to. Ken McIntosh said a lot that I agreed with, but in relation to the balance between the benefit system and employment, I would say to him in particular, and I suspect he would agree with me on this, that rather than following the UK Government's current strategy, which is to try and make unemployment less attractive, we need a strategy that makes employment more rewarding. And that's probably something for which there would be a consensus in Scotland. I will.
I thank Mr Stevenson for giving way. Likewise, I don't sit on the committee that produced this report, but as a former Deputy Chair of the Subordinate Legislation Committee, Mr Stevenson, I feel your pain in relation to those meetings. But as in terms of incentivising people into employment, I've not heard anyone mention yet reforms to the tax credit system, and a lot is made about gender inequalities in terms of underemployment. Do you think that reforms to the tax credit system in particular has disadvantaged a lot of female workers who are working part-time and would like to do more hours, and that is something the UK Government, whilst the power sits at a Westminster level, that they should consider, of course, in lieu of it not being with this Parliament at present?
Another minute, Mr Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The member makes a very good point. One of the arguments always for child benefit was that that was something that went straight to the mother, and therefore gave at least a modest bit of security to the mother. And I think the tax credit system, there are some difficulties with that as well. I'll just close by talking a little bit about zero-hour contracts. One of the difficulties is I'm not sure it's a contract, because a contract has an offer, an acceptance, and something that's of value that's delivered. And I'm not sure that the latter part is met. And I suspect it probably at some point will be legally challenged. I also think we need to be careful about imagining that skills will always find a home. It's not always going to be the case. We mustn't get locked into the idea that we have to preserve all the skills that we've once had. We simply won't succeed in that. And finally, Presiding Officer, taxation. And here's a little suggestion for Westminster. Directors of companies get no bonuses if they are more than 5% of the profits of the company they work for. The trick is, if there are no profits, there are no bonuses. Maybe there will be profits in the UK, then we can tax them and collect some of the tax. But there's a little thought, incomplete, not fully thought out, Presiding Officer.
Many, many thanks. Now call on Margaret MacDonald. 3 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for this time. And I come to this debate as someone who doesn't know what she's going to be when she grows up. I'm hoping I'm going to find out quite soon. But we mustn't imagine that this idea of underemployment is a new thing attributable to either Mrs Thatcher or Tony Blair. I was first elected 40 years ago in Govan, and Govan was deindustrialising then. That was the big problem. And much of that problem was that people were underemployed or unemployed. Mainly underemployed at that stage. Then 20 years ago, Ravenscraig shut, signalling the end of the Scottish steel industry. There was underemployment and unemployment and mismatched employment in Motherwell and Lanarkshire at that time. This is a problem we've had with us in Scotland for a very long time. I would suggest, since we lost the integration of much of Scotland's heavy industry, because it used to be an integrated steel industry, for example. All the skills were needed and used. But then when the steel industry was nationalised, it was rationalisation, it was called, that followed it. And that meant that the good jobs all went south of the border. And research and development went south of the border. So there was underemployment, and there was people doing work in Scotland who could have been doing much more and would have when it was an integrated industry in Scotland. So let's kid ourselves that it's anything new. It's just that we've managed to get by, and so we haven't paid it the attention that we should have. And now that it's having an effect on our society and the quality of our behaviour towards each other, and an effect on the quality of the services that we can afford to provide, we're looking at it much more seriously. But having said all that, I'm with Duncan McNeill, completely understand where he's coming from. If you've got no job at all, you'll take any job. You'll sell catalogues round the doors. You'll do anything. My mother did it when she was with it, and she was a nurse, and she sold stuff round the doors, and it was a dreadful job. And in those days, there was a lot more tenements than there are now, and she was up and down tenements with a big, heavy case. Dreadful work and dreadful money at the end of the week, and not sure how much money was going to come in, so how could she plan for anything? And lots of people were like that. But having said that, I'm still with Duncan. Any job is more than no job, because no job eats into the soul. Duncan wants an end to the contracts that are paying workers who work in this building rubbish money. So do I. But just supposing we manage to put 2 or 3 firms out of work, we will put out of work and into unemployment other people. So the thing is, when we talk about complexity, it's that simple. Unless we get it right, we create more unemployment.
Should we draw to a close now, please?
So what does Duncan and the others who pinpointed the problems, what do they want John Swinney to do about it? What does he cut from his budget to make sure that these workers are not paid rubbish wages, or that we underpay people providing services? That's the question that has to be answered, and everyone in here knows it. Unfortunately, we've got this event happening next year that is dividing us, because we don't need to be divided in this. We all know that there's 2 solutions. Either we have a socialist Britain or an independent Scotland.
Thanks very much. We now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Mary Scanlon for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would first of all like to commend Duncan McNeill and Margot MacDonald, because I think they not only brought reality to this topic, but also an understanding and empathy to the whole debate. I do commend the Energy, Enterprise and Tourism Committee on their 6th report in this session on underemployment in Scotland, but I do wonder if Chick Brodie and Mike Mackenzie ever turned up for the committee. Maybe they went to another committee, because over 3 months they actually signed up for the report, and I went through every single page. There's not one note of dissent, and yet they spent the whole speech speaking about anything except the report and disagreeing with everything that Murdo-Fraser, John Swinney and so many others had said. But there we are. I have to say that there are parts of the report that I had a little bit of difficulty with. Paragraph 62 notes the committee's concerns that there is a risk that some of the trends that have emerged during the economic downturn may become embedded in a way that makes work more insecure, particularly for the young and unskilled. And these risks are rightly involuntary part-time work, 0 hours contract, which many speakers have mentioned, and temporary contracts. But that was alongside self-employment. And I'm not quite sure why self-employment is regarded as a risky trend, because surely this should be encouraged in a country of budding entrepreneurs. And my second point is probably the definition of underemployment. Certainly not. Certainly not. I don't think you're in the same debate as I'm not sure you should even be here. And what I'm discussing has got absolutely no relation to your contribution today. You've had enough. You've had your chance. My second point is the definition of underemployment. And I think that there is a caution here about generalising everyone into one category, because over the years I've known many people, including myself, who would be regarded as underemployed, given that they're in jobs well below their level of competence, experience and qualification, but at that time the job suited them. And I think about the high influx of Polish and Eastern European migrants to the Highlands. Many professionally qualified people chose to work in hospitality or the retail sector in order to practice their language skills. They didn't feel confident in working in their own profession. Many people undertake further study, work in jobs that suit them at the time, and many people, after a long absence from work due to physical or mental illness, quite often take jobs with a level of responsibility that suits them at that time. So we should not assume that all those who would be designated as underemployed need our intervention to come in and sort them out. It's also a case that many people are content in the jobs that they do. Many people don't want to be managers, they don't want to be team leaders, and I think we should respect this view. And thirdly, and the debate today has reminded me of this very much, underemployment reminds me of the Peter principle, which in this context could be classified as overemployment. My personal view is that although there is no monetary loss to the individual, in fact the opposite is true, this is equally bad for business and bad for public service. The Peter principle is when people are promoted well above their level of competence to jobs with duties they cannot fulfil. Work is accomplished in this organisational hierarchy by those who have not reached their level of incompetence. I'm sure, Presiding Officer, we've all met them. No names, no pack drill, as they say. And then there is underemployment in terms of working hours, and this is also unique to the individual. And as a single mum, I worked part-time for many years in order to spend time with my children. Was I underemployed? Well, technically, yes, I was, but it was my choice. I wanted to drop my children at school, and not at the moment. I wanted to be there to pick them up at the gate, like other mums. And I didn't want anyone coming along saying you should be working full-time, not part-time, because I valued the time with my children. No. Also lectured for many years, and I just realised today, I lectured for many years on a 0-hours contract. I never complained. It actually suited me. And I'm delighted I did the work, and if I had the choice again, I'd go back and do it. So don't judge. No chance for you. And on reading the committee report, I will take Rhoda Grant. Yeah.
Rhoda Grant.
Can I just make a point that might help clarify the report to Mary? It is where people want to work more hours and indeed want to work at a higher skills level, which they have been trained to do. It's not saying to people who want to work part-time, indeed want to work in less skilled places, that they have to do that.
I appreciate that, but I do feel, as I listened today and as I read round the subject, there are over-generalisations around this topic, and I think there has to be an element of individual choice, and I appreciate that intervention. But on reading the committee report, I couldn't help drawing the comparison to the recent Audit Scotland report on early severance. The net loss of employees to the public sector in Scotland since 2009 is 40,000. We are assuming that the loss of 40,000 people has not impacted on the quality and delivery of public services, but this will be the subject of a future Audit Scotland report in the autumn. However, if we can lose 40,000 staff and deliver the same quality of service, what does that say about employment in the public sector? Were they really all overemployed? There is no doubting the complexity of underemployment and the challenges in developing measures to gather the data, which is stated in paragraph 1. But one figure did particularly shock me in this report, and it's on page 11, the diagram illustrating underemployment across Scotland. And it shows the city of Dundee, it's my hometown, I understand that, the city of Dundee and Shetland, with the highest levels of underemployment. Dundee I can understand, but why should oil-rich Shetland with hotel boats full of workers, suffer from underemployment? Could it be that recruiting agencies are bringing in workers from across the UK and wider afield, but not working with local agencies to ensure that people in Shetland Islands are given every opportunity for training? There may be a better explanation, and I look forward to it. Presiding Officer, I found this topic fascinating. The speech is interesting, and I would like to repeat my thanks to the committee, but it is right to say that we will have a way to go on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks. I now call on Rhoda Grant. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a good debate, I think, where a lot of members have made very pertinent points. Certainly the inquiry was an eye-opener to me. I always thought that any job was better than no job at all, but that was before I really saw the impact of underemployment. We heard about the personal and social impacts, very similar to unemployment, and Margaret McDougall and Duncan McNeill have mentioned that. Duncan especially mentioned health and life expectancy, which was very similar to unemployment, so there was no gain there for people who were underemployed. We also heard about the de-skilling of those that were underemployed, never reaching their full potential, even into adulthood, because they weren't able to use their skills and continue on a career path that was going to lead to them gaining that full potential. And we also heard about poverty. People trapped in underemployment with very low wages, but they can't give up that job because they can't get benefits. And I think Alison Johnston pointed that out in her contribution to the debate. And it was quite heartbreaking to hear some of the stories from Citizens' Advice when they came in front of the committee. Young people and women are disproportionately affected by underemployment, as many people have said. And underemployment does depend on what people want to do. If they want to work in a lesser skilled job, or indeed if they want to work part-time to bring up family, then they're not considered underemployed. And the same can be said about unemployment. I think it was John Mason that made the point, if you're unemployed, you're categorised as unemployed. Not necessarily. We have a category of people who are economically inactive, although they might dispute that description, who are unemployed but don't choose to be employed and aren't certainly looking for work at this moment in time. So the way they are measured is different, although obviously unemployment is more subjective. There is a huge impact on the economy because low incomes mean that there's less capacity to spend. And we heard evidence that this actually had a negative effect on the economy, where the recovery was actually being slowed by this. So when Gavin Brown was saying underemployment will improve as the economy improves, it might be a bit of the chicken and egg, because actually underemployment could be stalling any improvement in the economy. Marco Biagio also pointed out the impact on people who actually had no skills. The unskilled jobs that were normally available to them were no longer available because graduates were filling those posts. And Anne McTaggart made a similar point about students' jobs that were normally available for students going through university were now being kept by graduates who couldn't find alternative employment, and this was causing poverty and a knock-on effect there. There are solutions within the Scottish Government's gift. We need more affordable childcare. We need increased access to training and education to maintain skills, and also to re-skills for those who are underemployed. And we also need to look at ways of outlawing zero-hours contracts, both in the public sector, for their contractors, for grant funding. And I think a number of members made the point, and I think Kezia Dugdale made it very well, where when we're giving out public-funded grants, we need to look at what that company do. Do they pay their taxes? Do they have good employment practices before we give them that money? And I think we need to look at tightening up that criteria to make sure that public funding is spent properly for a public good. I'll give way to
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, the member has referred to affordable childcare and affordable housing, and what we really mean is the cheapest we can get. So how do we get round this fact that by having affordable childcare for some people who want to work or train, other folk are having to work for poverty wages?
Rhoda Grant.
And actually, there's many people working in childcare and poverty wages in this country, and yet it's the most expensive childcare anywhere else in Europe. So I would suggest that we have to go and look at what happens in the rest of Europe and make sure that we learn from their good example on that. I'll take another.
Bob Doris.
I really appreciate that. Just briefly, in terms of the cost of childcare in Scotland, I've asked various reports that have established that. They don't actually get beneath the detail to why it's more expensive. It could be a more qualified workforce. But in terms of childcare, do you believe there's a need for the expansion of partnership nurseries? Quite often traditional local authority nurseries who do a fantastic job, they're just not flexible enough to fit in with the working lives of all families, particularly female workers.
I think we need to look at every option, and indeed shared childcare as well is something that some people use. But we have to make sure childcare is there and available, not just between the hours of 9 to 5, but some of our lowest paid workers are actually working in supermarkets and the like that are beyond that. And sometimes the price that they're being asked to pay for childcare means that they shouldn't work at all, and that takes them out of being economically active, I think, to coin the phrase, that they may not wish to be. Many speakers also talked about the distinct gender profile that was recognised in underemployment. And I mean, when we look at underemployment in women being at 11.3% and 8.7% for men, and I think that the prevalence of this was that a lot of women worked in places where there was a lot of part-time work, a lot of low-paid work. They also took on caring responsibilities for children, as we've already spoken to, but also for elderly parents. And also, there was a lot of talk about gender segregation in the employment market, which others have spoken about. And John Mason was right that we need to broaden the horizons for young women. Gavin Brown made an interesting point about underemployment for part-time workers in the public sector, comparing that with those in the private sector. I think that is possibly lower in the public sector, because part-time workers in the public sector probably work at a higher level, have chosen to job share and the like, and there are better employment practices within the public sector which allow them to do that, whereas in the private sector many are in low-paid jobs, and I think that creates that anomaly. The Presiding Officer, as usual, I had loads more to say, but I can't say it as I'm running out of time. But can I just ask the Scottish Government to have a close look at outlawing zero-hours contracts? I think that's something they can do, and certainly the procurement bill can help them. Can they invest in skilling and reskilling where it's required, and reverse maybe some of the college cuts that have done away with part-time flexible courses for when they are very much required? And we need to think again to tackle this problem.
Many thanks. I now call on Angela Constance. Minister, you have up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, this has been a largely well-informed debate. Top marks to Marco Biaggi, the former researcher, for a very eloquent exposé of the links between education and our economy, and how we can gain more of the benefits of a first-class education system with a full range of economic powers. Can I also say that I very much enjoyed Duncan McNeill's contribution, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying that I found it uncharacteristically reflective and indeed humorous in parts, although he was covering some very serious issues. The Scottish Government very much welcomes the committee's report, and I hope that committee members will find the Scottish Government response to its very many recommendations very positive. We have responded positively, either in part or in full, to all the recommendations. we have a desire, like committee, to really get underneath the guts of the issue, and we want to seek more information. We've already published more information with regards to older and disabled workers, but we will seek ways to improve some of our measurement tools in terms of the skills utilisation measurement framework and also the national performance framework. As members know, the economy is absolutely key and central to our endeavours. Recent economic and employment indicators are encouraging. But the Government very much recognises the ethos of what the committee has articulated, in that while a feature of this recession is lower unemployment rates than anticipated, that we should not have a debate that falsely puts unemployment versus underemployment, and that we do have to consider both issues as part of a continuum. And the Scottish Government, we very much recognise the personal impact of health, poverty and on life chances of underemployment as well as unemployment. Because we know that the fuller participation in the labour market, that a better utilisation of skills and enabling more people to reach their potential will not only grow our economy, it will also help us to challenge inequality. And sustainable economic growth is essential. It is very much the starting place, and we have to make sure that when we do get economic recovery, we have to make sure that young people, women and other equality groups get their fair share of opportunities, because we know there is an economic cost of young people, women and other equality groups not being able to reach their full potential. Presiding Officer, I believe there is a number of actions that the Scottish Government can undertake. I believe there are actions that we are currently undertaking to tackle the long-term causes of underemployment. Many of our measures through Skills Development Scotland are about co-investment with employers in terms of flexible training opportunities, the Low Carbon Fund and the Energy Skills Fund also. Other work-based learning includes Scottish Union learning, very important in reaching members of the workforce that other services find hard to reach, particularly important in improving literacy of many workers, and it's something that the Scottish Government funds to the tune of £1.422 million every year. Let me also mention some specific programmes. The Scottish Government is investing in graduate internship programmes, essentially paid work experience, that have been very successful, and the outcomes of those programmes are leading to graduates getting into employment at a rate of between 70% and 75%. And in terms of very specific sectoral responses, both to skills shortages and underemployment, the skills investment plans and the skills action plans are crucially important in this regard. As Minister for Youth Employment, I am particularly interested in the notion of matching older and younger workers. There are some good examples of this already happening in the private and public sector. This very much chimes with their Make Young People Your Business campaign, which is about changing hearts and minds, encouraging employers to see the benefits of workforce planning and the benefits, the positive benefits of investing in young people, growing your own talent, particularly in light of ageing workforces. So this is an issue that we will discuss with the Scottish Employability Forum, and of course the whole range of issues in and around underemployment will be discussed with this forum also. I want, in the time that I have got remaining, Presiding Officer, touch on some very important infrastructure issues. It is very hard. Post-16 reform is about aligning the world of education with the world of work, and I hope that it is welcomed by committee members, the additional investment in taught postgraduate places and undergraduate places that are targeted at key economic sectors. I think in Scotland we know that we have yet to reap the full economic benefits of our first-class research, and there is much good work undergoing with our innovation centres and knowledge transfer partnerships. In terms of the college sector, there is the £61 million additional to planned budgets. and much of that money will be used to increase part-time provision for women returners, and it's an opportunity to increase bursaries and childcare grants as well. Now, Margaret McDougall and Alison Johnstone, amongst others, mentioned childcare, and of course this government is making a valuable step forward, I believe, with the Children and Young Persons Act, with the 600 hours commitment to childcare and early learning. But we have to be honest. We know that good quality childcare costs and that it cannot be done on the cheap. And yes, the costs of childcare are high in Scotland, although they're not the highest. There are many parts in England and elsewhere where the costs of nursery and childminding provision is higher. And we do have to recognise that this is primarily a female workforce, and the committee rightly makes the connections between the social care sector and underemployment. I know of one feminist economist who argues that once we start getting more men into childcare, that it is only then that we will see salaries in childcare increase. So the solution is not about reducing the costs of childcare. The answer is about how we better compensate either providers or parents. And I'm very glad that the Council of Economic Advisers is looking at the economic benefits of a universal childcare system, learning from the best in Europe, looking at models of delivery, models of funding, and how we move towards a sustainable and affordable universal childcare system. But of course, to complete that journey, we will indeed need the powers of independence, because the link between the labour market, tax and welfare is rather elementary. Presiding Officer, in the minute that I have left, I want to make very specific mention of 0 hours contracts. They've been mentioned by many members across the chamber today. As we've heard from Mr Swinney earlier in his contribution, the Government very much wants to seek more information about the prevalence of 0 hour contracts in Scotland, and we are considering what steps can be taken as part of procurement reform bill, because we want to look at specifically how procurement procedures can take account of workforce matters. But we do have to recognise that any action, even within the context of the procurement reform bill, has to be consistent with employment law and indeed European procurement legislation. And I very much welcomed, in part, the contribution from Kezia Dugdale and Duncan McNeill, who spoke about how we all have a responsibility to do absolutely everything that we can within the existing powers that we have. And I am very accepting of that. And I just hope, within that spirit, that other members, like Mr McNeill, can also accept and perhaps open their eyes to the benefits, potentially, of this Parliament having a full range of economic and employment law powers. And my final point, Presiding Officer, is that the Scottish Government for many years now has worked in close partnership with the STUC, because we are very committed and very publicly signed up to promoting, whenever and wherever we can, equality in the workplace. And if I can just end by saying I congratulate the committee for the thorough and interesting piece of work that they have undertaken.
Many thanks. I now call on Dennis Robertson to wind up on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Mr Robertson, you have until 5 o'clock, which is exactly 9.5 minutes, please.
You're very generous, Presiding Officer. Thank you. Presiding Officer, before I begin, I would certainly welcome a 2-minute indication, just to ensure that I come to some concluding remarks. I think it's been a very interesting and informative debate this afternoon. And I think, a great deal has been said around many of the issues. And in particular, I'd probably like to start with the areas around the constraints of underemployment. But maybe, perhaps, before I do, maybe the definition needs to be looked at again. I think it was Stuart Stevenson that said that the committee had gone into great detail around the definition of underemployment. It was certainly not a term that I was familiar with until we actually started looking at this report. And in hearing some of the members this afternoon, I'm not sure that everyone's grasping the actual definition as was presented in the report. Yes, some people do choose to work perhaps part-time. And I remember, as an employer myself, people coming to me and asking if they could reduce their hours for a variety of reasons. And it was a judgment I had to make in terms of their particular needs and that of the organisation. So that was by choice, but that's not the definition. The definition is around those who wish to work longer hours, those who are seeking additional hours to the hours that they've already got, those who have skills but are underskilled perhaps in the jobs that they are doing. So I think we have to be very clear around what the definition actually is. And I think I would commend the definition to members in the report. Looking at the various areas of constraint around underemployment, it was the convener who started off in his opening remarks when he mentioned young people and women. And of course, the third category in that area are people with disabilities. And people with disabilities are probably overrepresented within the underemployment area. And it was Capability Scotland themselves who said that they're overrepresented in this area and they have less opportunity of perhaps getting into the job market because there is less choice for many people with disabilities, given the nature sometimes of their actual disability. And I take on board the remarks by the Minister. And a lot of work has been done to try and balance this inequality area around people with disabilities back into the workplace. Perhaps I could also commend the opening remarks of the Cabinet Secretary, who I think was taking on board many of the recommendations within the report. And it's very welcoming to hear the Cabinet Secretary and indeed the Minister saying that the Government do recognise there is more to be done. And they are willing to look at ensuring that we get maybe more data, more appropriate data, so we can actually look at not just getting the evidence, but perhaps looking at appropriate solutions towards this area of underemployment. So, if it's taking on the whole workforce as a whole and trying to ensure that we do match up the work that is available with the skills that people actually have. Maybe move into the area because we find that underemployment isn't in one particular area of the country. It is regional, and there are certain regional variations. And we know that it does vary. And I learnt something this afternoon that I didn't know. And that was that Mary Scanlon is a Dundonian. And of course, in Dundee, the underemployment figures there are 13.6 people who are underemployed. But in Aberdeenshire, and part of my own constituency there, the numbers are actually about 9.1. So there are variations, and I do apologise to members from the Central Belt for not actually giving figures with their particular area. But, we also need to ask the local authorities themselves about collecting appropriate data to try and ensure that when they're looking at their employable strategies within their own local authority areas, that they have the most appropriate and up-to-date data to try and resolve some of the problems around underemployment. So the Government have given a commitment to look at this, and I think the committee were asking local authorities too to try and collect the appropriate data to ensure that we try and find solutions to this problem. Absolutely.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, he's touched already on the issue of the definition, and he's now saying about collecting data. I just wonder if he thinks there's practical problems in there, because if it's based on each individual person's attitude and what they want, how is it really possible to collect that data in a kind of objective way?
Dennis Robertson.
I thank the member, and I think we, at the outset, and I think it was perhaps Gavin Brown who reinforced the fact that this is a very complex matter. And I think John Mason is putting his finger on the complexities around perhaps this area of collecting the appropriate data.
and in understanding the definition. But I think in collecting that information, if the local authority and certainly government is clear about the information they are trying to collect around the definition, I'm sure the data would be informative. Around collection of data and information, I think we must commend Marco Biagi for being the champion for the graduates, and certainly the 13,000, if I remember right, of the constituents that he actually represents. And I think he probably does deserve the accolade of being the SWAT on the EET committee, with reference to that. I think the other area we want to look at is the in-work poverty, a term, presiding officer, that I'm certainly not comfortable with. And can I commend again the contribution from Duncan McNeill? I think it was said with a great deal of emotion, passion, and it was delivered, I think, extremely well. And I think Mr McNeill was absolutely right. For many people, they will take a job regardless, because people in the main want to work. But what we are finding is that people are actually working, and the paycheck at the end of the day is not rewarding enough. And the benefit system as is, and the problem, I think, with the welfare reform, is that people are finding themselves in even greater poverty than they were before. And of course, students themselves are also in this area of this in-work poverty, in that quite often they work long hours, again for very little reward.
2 minutes, Mr Robertson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And it was Dr McCormick from the Rowntree Foundation who said that for many of these people, they're in a sort of revolving door of insecurity with regard to their employment. And I think, when we look at this in terms of the employment of young people, people who are trying to get more work, or disabled people, the well-being factor is one that we need to also consider.
Yes.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I wonder if the member thinks there might be a connection between the complexities and difficulties of underemployment and unemployment and poor quality employment, and the fact that the British economy is slipping down every single measure of economic performance that I can think of.
1 minute, Mr Robertson.
I thank the member for the intervention. I was actually going to finish on a positive note, however. And that was to say that we do welcome the albeit slight, economic growth within the Scottish economy at the moment. And I think we need to look to the sort of brighter future in terms of that. And in addressing the problems, it's probably the solution to this complexity of the underemployment. And, Presiding Officer, can I offer my thanks to the convener and to the other members of the committee, and certainly the clerking team, for I think it is a report which I think Gavin Brown said as well, is one that probably poses more questions than answers at the moment. However, I believe this government is up to answering the questions that has been put before it, and I commend the motion in the name of Murdo-Fraser to the Chamber. Thank you.
Well done. And we now move on to the next item of business, as that concludes the debate on underemployment in Scotland. And the next item of business is decision time. And there is one question to be put as a result of today's business. And the question is that motion 6782 in the name of Murdo-Fraser on underemployment in Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. And that concludes decision time, and we will now move on to members' business, and I would ask members who are leaving the chamber to do so quietly, please.